Welcome everybody to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. I'm David Miller. I'm the Secretary of the Existentialist Society. And our speaker today is Dr. Timothy Deane-Freeman, and his topic is Deleuze and Luhmann, Paradox, System, and Psychoanalysis. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come and address the Existentialist Society again. I was just saying before, I had a really good time last time I came and spoke to everybody, so hopefully we can have some really good, productive discussion after I read the paper that I'm going to present. The paper itself, I should say, people often make this rhetorical gesture of saying this is work in progress. This really, really is work in progress, right? This is an unfinished paper. This is really exegesis. A lot of it is me trying to think things through. So not necessarily sort of polished ideas, not necessarily ideas that I myself fully have sort of grasped or understood at this point. So I'm really hoping that, in the conversation section of today, all of you, we can sort of form a bit of a collective mind, and all of you can help me to sort of think through some of the ideas here. This is actually this material, so bringing together Niklas Luhmann, who's a 20th century German sociologist, and Gilles Deleuze, who's a 20th century French philosopher. This sort of project is actually sort of applied in a very sort of broad sense. So I'm hoping actually to do some work with the shared conception of sense, which both of these kind of thinkers have, in thinking about certain problems related to constitutional theory, actually. Without getting into the nuts and bolts of that, because it's not something that I'm going to speak about today, essentially, when you have a constitution, a constituted legal order, there's this thing that is presupposed by the constitution, which is a constituent power. This is the power that has sort of authorized or empowered the constitution. And constituent power is a sort of ambiguous and somewhat paradoxical sort of concept, in as much as it's something which is both inside and outside of a given legal system. And this is really the sort of paradoxical situation which interests me and which sort of led me to this work in Deleuze and Luhmann on the paradoxical nature or structure of sense itself. So I won't talk about that political philosophy stuff, because that's still sort of stuff I'm figuring out. We can talk about it if anyone has any specific sort of questions about it in the latter part of today. But really, what I'll offer, I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so. What I'll offer is just exegesis, essentially, of these two respective thinkers and their accounts of sense, and a few remarks as to why bringing them together in this way is a useful or productive thing to do. So I'll start with with an epigraph and a provocation. So the epigraph is from Niklas Luhmann's Theory of Society, Volume 2, where he says, "Paradox is the orthodoxy of our times." At the heart of this, obviously, is the notion of doxa, key kind of idea for the ancient, going back to the ancient Greeks, this idea of inherited opinion, as in orthodoxy, some sort of unquestioned belief that we've inherited maybe from our culture, right? So, I'll say it again. This is Luhmann sort of characterizing modernity. Paradox is the orthodoxy of our times. And I'll offer a kind of paradox, which is one that Deleuze himself certainly finds compelling, and one which we find in ancient Stoic philosophy, the idea that the skin is the deepest part of the body. Right? So a paradoxical idea, but in as much as the skin is sensitive, right? It's that the sort of largest sensory organ. It's in some respects the organ that's capable of the most profound, sensory experience, or something like this, despite its being an ostensible sort of thin surface, right? So two sort of epigraphs to just get us thinking about this paradoxical structure of sense. Okay, so in what follows, I map the concept of sense across the works of Gilles Deleuze and Nicholas Luhmann. I then turn to Deleuze's engagement with psychoanalysis in order to give an account of the diachronic genesis of sense in the autoerotic activity of infants. My claim is that in bringing these thinkers together in this way, we might better grasp not only certain paradoxes generated in and by our ways of speaking, but also a set of confusions and sufferings which relate to the paradoxical beings we are. Indeed, I want to suggest that in each case, what we are grappling with is the paradoxical structure of sense. So in French, sens, in German, Sinn or Sinn, generally rendered in English translations of Luhmann as meaning, right? So sense, meaning, but which in both French and German condenses a cluster of implications, including feeling, thought, and direction. For both Luhmann and Deleuze, the domain of sense is paradoxical inasmuch as it is simultaneously both closed and open, foundational and founded. As the condition for a world of sensible things, sense is effectively absolute. Its outside perceptible only in the form of nonsense, a category itself established in and through the medium of sense. At the same time, both thinkers are committed to a post-scientific epistemology, which grants that sense is an empirical effect and produced by certain real or spatio-temporally extended processes. So we're not in the realm of a kind of absolute idealism here. I just want to flag that at the outset. In this context, the difficulty is that of thinking sense as simultaneously both condition and conditioned, an effect or residue of contingent operations in the world, which at the same time acts as the medium in which both world and operator are able to appear as such. Deleuze's originality lies in charting this paradoxical situation through philosophy, literature, and psychoanalysis, each of which expresses it in different ways. In the paradoxes of Stoic philosophy, the nonsense literature of Lewis Carroll and Artaud, and the bizarre hysterical symptoms of the psychoanalytic patient, Deleuze charts the ontogenetic reality, according to which sense is always in excess of a finite, embodied situation, opening that situation up to both the future and the past, and acting as the guarantor of the most radical form of change. Luhmann, meanwhile, approaches these same issues via systems theory, and our conception of sense-using systems as those which depend upon an ongoing capacity for decision or distinction, paradigmatically that of whether or not a given event belongs to or is caused by the sense-using system itself. Viewed in this light, sense is always the property of a system which relies upon a quasi-mythic operation of self-founding, a moment of decision which distributes both the system and its outside, or sense and nonsense. Reintegrating this potentially traumatic outside as a known unknown, or paradox. Before, however, we can turn to these latter claims, I should say, we must introduce both Luhmann and Deleuze, with particular attention to the account of sense which connects their disparate projects. So I'll start with Luhmann. Luhmann's occasional references to Deleuze, so this is what started me off on this particular research, is that Luhmann, who is this sociologist, makes reference to a perhaps unexpected source in the philosopher Gilles Deleuze. So Luhmann's occasional references to Deleuze have been the source of a small yet productive critical commentary centered on the work of Hannah Richter and Andreas Philippopoulos Mihalopoulos. As Richter has observed, the Deleuze-Luhmann pairing appears at first blush somewhat incongruous, marrying as it does an oftentimes aridly formal sociology to the most anarchic tendencies of French so-called post-structuralism. However, as Richter notes, quote, Deleuze and Luhmann's theories of sense are their exact mirror image. For both, sense is productive, but at the same time always itself produced. Creative sense is without absolute ground or outside. Its only limitation is the underside of nonsense co-produced by every act of sense-making. Luhmann deploys this anti-foundational conception of sense in the context of his long-standing critique of classical sociology. Against this tradition, which he claims is rooted in a dubious metaphysical distinction between observed object and observing subject, Luhmann understands sociology as an autological or self-descriptive process, albeit one with a degree of epistemological purchase, which derives from its status as a form of, quote, second-order observation, end quote, or an observation of observers. Indeed, Luhmann's thought refuses wholesale the idea of a neutral, pre-observed reality, which might be more or less successfully discovered and described by the sciences, be they social or natural. All observations are part of the self-creating or autopoietic projects of observers, which communicate these observations, both internally and to one another, in the service of their autopoiesis, or self-creation. In this context, Luhmann explains, quote, although the notion that reality is to be recognized by the resistance it exerts can be retained, it has to be admitted that such resistance to communication can only be recognized through communication, end quote, in a model which effectively denies the outside of communication any substantive reality. So we can only think what we can think, basically, right? And we're only thinking it in the process of, in the service of a project of self-creation, okay? For Luhmann, both observation and communication rely on an autopoietic system's capacity for making distinctions, which he follows George Spencer Brown in characterizing as forms or boundaries. Quote, markings of differences that oblige us to make clear which side we are indicating, and thus which side of the form we are on. Our point of departure for further operations, end quote. So I distinguish myself from others, for instance, purely in the context of like some kind of contingent project of self-creation or self-actualization. And I distinguish, discrete individuals, listening to my talk, likewise in the service of a kind of autopoietic project, right? So these are operational distinctions ultimately. The fundamental such distinction is that between the system and its environment, which a given system affects with reference to its own autopoietic potentials. In the most basic terms, this amounts to a system attributing the cause of some events to itself and others to an external milieu or outside. Importantly, however, Luhmann follows Maturana and Varela in insisting that autopoietic systems are operationally closed, which is to say that they relate to their outside only in terms of its tendency to initiate certain internal processes. To take a simple example, the mammalian eye, far from allowing for the transparent passage of light, rather acts as a receptive surface capable of generating various forms of self-irritation. From the perspective of an autopoietic systems theory, these irritations should be understood not as originating in the environment itself, but in the sensory organs and nervous system, which are essentially self-stimulating and autological, communicating differences internally in the service of homeostasis. Operational closure, in other words, means that autopoietic systems are always and essentially interested only in that which concerns their ongoing projects of autopoiesis. Viewed in this light, the environment is nothing more than a source of irritation or information, as to required adjustments to a given system's internal operating frequencies. Anything which appears as distinction to an observer, up to and including the radically indistinct, is somehow operationally useful and part of an ongoing autopoiesis. And it's in this sense that we must understand Luhmann's claim that, quote, resistance to communication can only be exercised through communication, end quote, given that the opacity of the noumenal thing is itself a source of information. What distinguishes Luhmann's approach from autopoietic models at work in biology, however, is his conviction that operational closure is far from unique to living beings, and is also observable in psychic and social systems, which also work through the production and communication of distinctions. But whereas an autopoietic system like the mammalian individual is bounded by quite tangible sites of exclusion or distinction, the mucous membranes, the skin, etc., an adequate theorization of multiply embodied systems like societies requires an alternate mode of distinction, which Luhmann locates in the domain of sense explicitly. At this point, it should be noted that for Luhmann, the foundational distinction between system and environment is not a historically singular determination. Rather, what characterizes autopoietic systems as both operationally closed and temporally extended is their ongoing re-entry of this distinction and an observation as to its effects within the system, a model Luhmann articulates with reference to Spencer Brown's idiosyncratic work in formal logic. Through a continual reinsertion of the distinction between system and environment, in other words, the autopoietic system changes, reproducing a margin of indeterminacy, which enables it to select new states, as such producing a future. At the same time, re-entry establishes the system's memory or history, the series of past states upon which it might draw in the context of this determination, and which constitute its identity as system. Luhmann designates the results of this ongoing re-entry as they are manifest to the system with the term sin, sense, or meaning, indicating the horizon of past states and future potentials which imbue both system and environment with their particular qualities. So one way of just very briefly clarifying what's going on here at perhaps like a less abstracted level is to me as autopoietic system, you all constitute environment, right? And likewise. So this is a kind of arbitrary distinction in the context of a particular sort of process of self-creation, right? There's some kind of cut that's made according to which I've decided that, I, or indeed my culture in giving me a name, has decided that, I am a kind of temporally continuous process or individual of some kind. There's an externality, which is my environment, the environment in which I as a system operate. But obviously when we think about, I had, for instance, a little precancerous potentially spot cut off of me the other day. Obviously that's not something that I did intentionally, right? So the body itself becomes in some way a part of environment, for depending on the perspective that we are sort of taking, right? So there's a I don't want to say fictive necessarily, right? But there's certainly a kind of synthetic dimension, right, to what's going on here in the determination that some things belong to the system and other things don't, right? There's something almost sort of fictional happening here. Or as Luhmann explains, autopoietic systems, quote, mark off an area of events, actions, whose occurrence they attribute to themselves. The interdependencies between these actions give rise to a complexity that can be symbolized in the system and be reflected as a unity of the system. In this regard, it remains accessible to the system in the form of sense, which, however, can no longer be traced operationally. The same goes for the system's environment, which is unity only for and through the system, right? In order to properly grasp this idiosyncratic approach to sense, we must be attentive to two key theoretical axioms. Firstly, for Luhmann, sense thus constitutes a functional reduction of complexity, a synthesis of disparate elements or events which renders them the potential objects of ongoing, temporally extended operations. Second, the structural coupling of the autopoietic system and its outside necessitates a mechanism via which the system includes or accommodates an environment which is defined in terms of its exclusion. This paradoxical situation is inscribed in the very structure of sense, conceived as an operational and as such intrinsically arbitrary process of distinction between that which belongs and does not belong to the system. As Luhmann writes, citing Deleuze directly, quote, "All sensible operations always reproduce the presence of what has been excluded, for the world of sense is a complete world, which can exclude what it excludes only in itself. Nonsense, too, can therefore be thought and communicated only in the medium of sense, only in the form of sense." So the kind of traditional opposition in a lot of linguistic philosophies, right, between sense and nonsense as a kind of negation of sense or as the opposite of sense, something like this. Luhmann, like Deleuze, is trying to get rid of this distinction altogether, right? We need to understand nonsense actually as a particular modulation of sense, as something which is, properly speaking, internal to the domain of sense, right? This amounts, as I've suggested, to a radical anti-foundationalism. Sense both produces and is produced by the autopoietic system, along with its world or reality. The claim that the world is a product of sense should not, however, be mistaken as signifying either a relativism or an idealism. Luhmann, as we have said, is dedicated to a set of epistemological commitments which hold that reality is the site of certain empirically determinable properties. Like Deleuze, he's trying to do something that's compatible with scientific method, it should be said, right? And science as descriptive power, right? Which, neither of these thinkers is going to deny. The mistake of disciplines like sociology has been to neglect the fact that these properties are determined exclusively in and through the medium of sense, which enables the appearance of reality not as some particular predetermined order, but rather as a resistance of communication to communication, which is to say, as the moment at which some not yet communicable distinction appears in the domain of sense. The mode of this appearance is nonsense, which as such attains a productive and no longer a negative valence in Luhmann's thought, indicating not just types of distinction that can't yet be made, but the emergence of new and surprising distinctions which constitute the proper object of science. It's this situation which has been neglected by classical sociology with its dubious metaphysical presuppositions. In observing an object, the observer creates it by making and communicating distinctions. The communication of these distinctions takes place in the medium of sense, which constitutes a complete world inasmuch as it also determines those distinctions or observations that can't be made, the latter subject to statements of nonsense. The worlds created in and by sense are thus radically contingent as well as effectively total. How are we to understand this paradox? And how does it emerge from the structure of sense itself? Where does sense come from exactly? And why is it simultaneously both closed and open? In order to answer these questions, we must turn to Deleuze and to his idiosyncratic logic of sense. This is the second part of the paper, really focused on Deleuze's book, The Logic of Sense, which I'm a Deleuze scholar, but I had not really dedicated myself to this book until very recently. So this is all pretty new territory for me and pretty baffling, I should say. So Deleuze's project in The Logic of Sense is to provide an account of both the structure and genesis of sense as distinct from its expression in any given proposition of the order of truth or falsehood. In this context, he eschews what he takes to be the aridity of discussions around the sense or nonsense of individual propositions, such as had tended to preoccupy analytic philosophies of language. This latter paradigm, famously, had founded in its attempts to ground mathematics in set theory, failing to account for the possibility of a set which might be constructed in such a way as to both include and not include itself, as per Russell's paradox. And while analytic philosophy would thus dedicate itself to the circumvention of paradox, conceived as that which threatens the sense of a given theoretical paradigm or system of reference, Deleuze undertakes to elaborate an eccentric logic of paradox, conceived as the logic of sense. Indeed, sense, for Deleuze, is paradoxical inasmuch as it is a non-existent entity, a being which has neither substance nor extension, but which nevertheless subsists or inheres in the structure of language, acting as the condition for its functions of denotation, manifestation, and signification. Sense may well be expressed in a given proposition, but it is irreducible thereto, inasmuch as it occupies real relations, albeit not simply referential ones, with a non-linguistic world of things. As Deleuze explains, quote, sense is both the expressible or the expressed of the proposition and the attribute of the state of affairs. It turns one side towards things and one side towards propositions, but it does not merge with the proposition which expresses it, any more than with the state of affairs or the quality which the proposition denotes, I should say. It is exactly the boundary between propositions and things. So in a way, the problem here is, I suspect quite a simple one. How is it that a word is not the same as the thing? What's the distance that separates the two, a word and the thing that ostensibly denotes the thing? Sense, in other words, is neither strictly linguistic nor physical. Rather, for Deleuze, sense is a pure event, as irreducible to propositions as to the objects they ostensibly indicate. Deleuze characterizes the Stoics as having been the first philosophers to provide an account of this paradoxical dimension of sense, associating it with the Stoic concept of incorporeal sayables or lecta. These are, quote, not physical qualities and properties, but rather logical or dialectical attributes, end quote, which emerge in response to the problem of the spatio-temporal continuity of bodies. So how is it that it's the same body after, like, its arm is cut off or something like this, right? For the Stoics, or indeed, and this is another way of talking about the problem that I'm looking at overall here, given that, people love this cliche, I don't know if it's true, about how our cells are replaced entirely every 7 years or whatever it is, right? So you renew body, right, sort of ceaselessly. How is it that we can speak about, for instance, human individuals as being temporally continuous individuals, right, given that they're ceaselessly new in this way? The answer, of course, is through the medium of sense, right? For the Stoics, when a given body is cut with a knife, the incorporeal sayable is cut becomes true of the persisting body, which rather than being replaced by a new body, instead assumes this new attribute or mode of being. Without delving into the specifics of Stoic thought here, what's essential is that the sayable is thus an event as opposed to a body, and accessible to logic as such. Furthermore, the Stoics distinguished utterances, their reference, and that by which the two are connected, a third term not unlike Frege's sense. Importantly, this connective element, the state of affairs signified and sayable, is irreducible to the utterance itself, given that distinct utterances might have the same referent, for instance, morning star, evening star, to use Frege's famous example. What interests Deleuze in these features of Stoic thought is their articulation of a domain which is neither strictly physical nor mental, but which seems nevertheless to condition the appearance of both. Indeed, the relative autonomy of this domain of sense is illustrated in a series of paradoxes which emerge when language is brought to bear upon itself, and which stem from the fact that one can only talk about sense from within it. Quote, "I never state the sense of what I am saying," writes Deleuze, "but I can always take the sense of what I say as the object of another proposition, whose sense, in turn, I cannot state," end quote. Or again, quote, "Propositions which designate contradictory objects themselves have a sense," end quote. Which is to say that while square circles and married bachelors do not exist, they nevertheless insist in the propositional form. These paradoxes stem from the unique structure of sense, which is self-containing, and as such the site of potentially infinite determinations. Like Luhmann, Deleuze thus conceives of sense as the medium for an endlessly creative, immanent, and anti-foundational world-making, and of nonsense as both limit and reservoir to this ongoing metamorphosis. What specifies Deleuze's approach is his emphasis on this latter, productive aspect of nonsense, a theme he develops through an analysis of literary language. The play between good sense and nonsense in the work of Lewis Carroll, in particular, thus becomes a paradigm for the productive powers of a sense no longer yoked in the service of logical reference. In the movement according to which Alice shrinks and expands, Deleuze perceives a science of pure events and a creative use of nonsense as that which dislocates established orders. Quote, "When I say Alice becomes larger, I mean that she becomes larger than she was. By the same token, however, she becomes smaller than she is now. Alice does not grow without shrinking, and vice versa. Good sense affirms that in all things there is a determinable sense or direction." Bearing in mind in French, sens means direction. But paradox is the affirmation of both senses or directions at the same time. Just like a grin without a cat, in other words, change is paradoxical, indicating the moment at which things both are what they are and aren't. Deleuze sees language, and literary language in particular, as capable of expressing this ontogenetic reality, according to which identity is always a synthetic and doxic projection, and good sense, far from evenly distributed, is riddled with cracks and aporia. Inasmuch as it is capable of staging these paradoxes, language thus becomes a powerful tool in the service of what Deleuze takes to be philosophy's mission, of breaking with doxa in order to effect new ways of thinking and living. Indeed, in this respect, the logic of sense constitutes an idiosyncratic moment in the Deleuzean oeuvre, given a hostility towards the equivocations of language, which characterizes his thinking more broadly. However, unlike many other adherents of the so-called linguistic turn, which often tends towards a sort of ascetic closure, Deleuze is interested in language precisely as the vehicle for an indeterminate creativity, far in excess of the strictures of a given logical order. The name Deleuze gives to this creative movement is sense, which is only ever common or good in an arbitrary way and in keeping with particular interests. Indeed, in the form of nonsense, which must no longer be understood in terms of negation, but again as a kind of excess, sense emerges as an impersonal, ontogenetic power, immanent to language, yet irreducible to its communicative and rational functions. Deleuze formalizes these productive powers of nonsense by drawing on the concepts of a then dominant structuralist paradigm. At this point in his career, structuralism is productive for Deleuze due to its preponderance of tripartite models, which acknowledge the inadequacy of one-to-one or correspondence theories of language. In important passages of the logic of sense, Deleuze thus uses a vocabulary taken from structural linguistics, according to which a given structure is defined by the presence of at least two heterogeneous series, one of which is determined as signifying and the other as signified, with each series comprising terms or singularities which are constituted only through their differential relations, which is to say the positions they occupy vis-a-vis one another. So, if I say tree and you successfully sort of apprehend what I'm, the sign that I'm using, it's only by virtue of the fact that I haven't said Trey or Troy or, what have you, right? This is a kind of identity which is differentially composed, right? Importantly for Deleuze, and ditto, right, when you recognize a tree, you only recognize it by virtue of the fact that it's not grass or, what have you. Importantly, for Deleuze, these heterogeneous series converge towards a paradoxical element, which acts as their, quote, differentiator, end quote. This paradoxical element is nonsense, a non-identical instance or moment of structure, whose function, Deleuze writes, quote, is to traverse the heterogeneous series, to coordinate them, to make them resonate and converge, and to introduce into each one of them multiple disjunctions, end quote. In order to grasp this difficult idea, we must recall both that the French term sense holds connotations of direction, so sens, and that for Deleuze, nonsense, non-sens, must be thought as a kind of excess, as opposed to a lack or negation. The structural model, with its discrete with its discrete series of words and of things, is thus set in motion by an unstable and indeterminate event of nonsense, which, given its participation in both series at once, belongs fundamentally to neither. So this is something that's neither a word or a body, right? Yet somehow sort of describes or distributes words and bodies, or words and things. As a result of this vagrancy, the paradoxical element is always displaced in relation to itself, constituting the site of an ineradicable structural instability. That the terms here are opaque suggests the necessary opacity of this object, which is essentially empty and mobile. Deleuze nevertheless gives as examples the Lacanian phallus, the void of Zen Buddhism, and Levi-Strauss's mana, each of which constitutes a site of undecidability or indeterminacy, which animates a given system or structure. To take the first of these examples, we might recall that in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the phallus is understood not in anatomical terms, but rather as an arbitrary signifier of difference. The Lacanian subject, whatever genital they might possess, is forever haunted by the question of the phallus's presence or absence, conceived as that prosthesis which both permits and prohibits enjoyment. In Deleuze's terms, this aleatory point is what distributes the singular terms constitutive of structure, animating their complex relations. In moving between them, it produces the effect of sense, which emerges through its ongoing differentiation and traversal of series. As Sean Bowden has shown, the paradoxical element thus implies both personal and impersonal elements. Inasmuch as there is a form of agency which instigates the connective movement constitutive of sense, but which is itself necessarily nonsensical or empty, the paradoxical element bears more than a passing resemblance to some kind of transcendental subject. At the same time, and in keeping with what Deleuze will call his transcendental empiricism, this subject must be understood to be itself derived from the structure of structure, emerging as an effect of the differential play of singularities. In order to understand this tension and the relationship between Deleuze's structural account of sense and the agency which it seems to imply, we must turn to the second part of the logic of sense and Deleuze's account of what he calls the dynamic genesis of sense. Here, Deleuze draws on work in the fields of psychoanalysis and developmental psychology in order to chart the movement according to which an infant gradually attains both language and capacities for self-reference. This dual event of language, which both distributes the series of words and of things and establishes the subject as irrevocably split, sees the infant come to grasp the complex differential structures of language via an apprenticeship in the sonorous qualities of bodies, arriving at sense through nonsense. And indeed, it's this situation which renders the structure of sense irreducibly paradoxical and linked to a conflictual subject. So this is the final section of the paper and the most half-baked, right? So There's plenty here that I'm yet to sort of figure out for myself, right? But this is Deleuze's account of sort of, or engagement with psychoanalysis, right? Deleuze's engagement with psychoanalysis is typically erudite and draws on a wide range of thinkers. At its center, however, are Jacques Lacan and Melanie Klein and their respective accounts of castration and splitting. For Lacan, we might recall, castration indicates not an anatomical procedure, but rather the infant's traumatic passage into a symbolic order which necessarily precedes her, establishing her as constitutively divided. According to this account, and following Freud, being a subject therefore involves being subjected to social conventions appositional to our diverse drives and bodily affects. In Lacan's earliest formulations, which center on the set of imaginary identifications that establish the self as recursive, this experience is such that the unity of a self is always experienced in opposition to a diffuse and uncontrolled physicality, setting the stage for a more or less explicitly aggressive self-relation. This is the famous mirror stage in Lacan. Deleuze's originality lies in grasping this transition in terms of the infant's production of sense, which acts as a kind of prophylactic against the horrifying experience of depths, in particular the depths of the body. In the same movement according to which she enters the field of social relations, the infant thus gradually separates bodies from words, generating sense as a kind of defensive boundary or surface. In order to grasp this difficult idea, we might recall that psychoanalysis begins with the basic thesis of a schizoid infant, governed entirely by the pleasure-displeasure principle and unable to appreciate the independent existence of others. In characterizing this position, Deleuze draws on the object relations school, and Melanie Klein in particular, taking up the latter's conception of splitting. For Klein, the infant begins to constitute its nascent psyche by dividing reality into good and bad objects, introjecting and identifying with the good and fantasizing about destruction of the bad. Unable to bear the ambivalence associated with a breast which both appears and refuses to appear, and which is at least initially understood to be an effect of the infant's own activity, the breast is thus split, becoming two distinct phantasmic objects, whose destiny in either case is to be devoured. As Deleuze writes, in terms which draw directly on Klein, quote, "Orality, mouth, and breast are initially bottomless depths. Not only are the breast and the entire body of the mother split apart into a good and a bad object, but they are aggressively emptied, slashed to pieces, broken into crumbs and alimentary morsels," end quote. So this is where we all come from, according to this psychoanalytically informed account, right? From this initially aggressive, schizoid, omnipotent, and polymorphously perverse weatherscape, the infant must ultimately escape through synthetic operations of introjection and sublimation, the conditions for a fragile identity, which works to regulate both internal and external innervations. Importantly, for Deleuze, this movement is characterized by two key orienting vectors. On the one hand, from amidst the cacophony of the depths, there emerges a recurrent familial hum or voice, the rhythmic presences and absence of which lay the foundation for the subsequent emergence of language. And there's this really beautiful through line in Logic of Sense, this connection of, so the voice, right, paradigmatically, the mother's voice, right, it comes from above, and it's either there or it's not there, it alternates. So, this establishes the sort of binarism or the constitutive difference at the heart of language. And there's this beautiful connection of this image of the voice that comes from above with transcendent forms of philosophy, right? So Platonism, etc. The idea that there is some, ideal realm up there. And Deleuze begins the Logic of Sense by contrasting these philosophies of the heights with the pre-Socratic philosophies of the depths, right? So, Heraclitus and so on, for whom, It's all an affair of bodies consuming one another, a universe of flame, etc. So what Deleuze is trying to do here is use psychoanalysis to naturalize, ultimately provide a kind of developmental account of philosophical thought, right, in the erotic activity of infants. So really, love it or hate it, and I'm sure there'll be some hate, as there always is when psychoanalysis enters the fray. It's a really, really intriguing project, I think. So there's this emergence of the familial voice on high. On the other, there is an erotogenic organization of the infant's body as a surface, a coordination of the diverse erogenous zones, which ultimately affects the ego. In French and German, simply the I, translated, unfortunately, in English into this technical sounding term, ego, conceived as a unitary site of enjoyment. As Deleuze explains, drawing on Freud's diachronic accounts of sexual development in a passage worth quoting at length, quote, the organization of zones and the organization of stages, this is sort of oral, anal, phallic, genital, occur, of course, almost simultaneously, since all positions are elaborated during the first year of life, each one encroaching on the preceding position and intervening in its course. But the essential difference is that the zones are facts of the surface, and that their organization implies the constitution, the discovery, and the investment of a third dimension, which is no longer either depth or height. One could say that the object of a zone is projected, but projection no longer signifies a mechanism of depth. It now indicates a surface operation, an operation occurring on the surface. The synthetic organization of sexuality, in other words, in its coordination of singular points which together comprise a complex system of resonance, is also the condition for the infant's production of the event of sense, consisting as it does in the establishment of a receptive surface prone to both internal and external innovation. These two components of the infant's acquisition of language, the parental voice and the synthesis of a receptive surface, are of course intimately linked and establish a situation whereby the infant's pleasure-seeking activities are inextricable from its capacity to evoke and ultimately produce the sonic modulations which transform noise to voice and voice to language. This attainment, however, is always precarious, given that the genesis of sense takes place against the backdrop of the resonant depths from which it is derived and with which it is ultimately coextensive. We've already seen how Carroll's experiments with nonsense revealed the non-identity masked by socially sanctioned forms of sense, good sense, common sense, which produce such surface effects as consistent, temporally bounded individuals. Part of the delight of poetry, indeed, lies in its rearticulation of phonemic relations latent to, but papered over by, denotative uses of language, returning us to the language of childhood. The task of being properly socialized is that of learning to forget or ignore these resonances, which can interfere with efficient communication. They are always, however, capable of reappearing, as in the case of parapraxes, poems, and madness. Indeed, Deleuze's discussion of Artaud's schizophrenia gives us a sense of what occurs once, quote, there is no longer any surface, end quote. And when the event of sense collapses back into the cacophony of bodies and their depths. In this context, quote, the world loses its sense, that is, its power to draw together or to express an incorporeal effect distinct from its present realization. Every event is realized, be it in a hallucinatory form. Every word is physical and immediately affects the body, end quote, in a situation which renders schizophrenia both the potential source of immense linguistic invention and a kind of bottomless personal terror. For our purposes, what's essential is the way in which Deleuze's genetic account thus establishes the real conditions for the paradoxical structure of sense. The fact that sense is a third dimension between bodies and words is related to its sexual origins and the infant's defensive constitution of imaginary erogenous surfaces, including the ego and the sensible world which surrounds it. Because this process relies on terms which are socially determined, words, the rules of language, it results in a subject which is fundamentally split, entering a symbolic order which appears as effectively total. In this context, the subject is thus included as an exclusion and must traverse structure in a lifelong attempt to solve the various problems that it poses. This is the movement which generates sense, at the same time producing the subject. Again, we might note the solidarity between Deleuze and Luhmann here, given their shared conception of sense as that which establishes both an agent and the environment in which it operates. In both cases, this involves an act of foundation, which is only ever retrospective, given the fact that sense is a product of ongoing operations. As Luhmann writes, in terms which underline the intersubjective forces at play here, quote, only when the system is operating and has built up sufficient complexity to describe itself in the temporal dimension can it postcipiate its beginning. The determination of a beginning, an origin, a source, and oh no, before is a myth fabricated in the system itself, or an account by another observer, end quote. The founding distinction, in other words, while artificial or imaginary, is nevertheless essential for successful operations in sense. Without an original act of decision, the subject or system is unable to animate the recursive movements which make it precisely a subject. Indeed, in psychoanalytic terms, we might say that the subject is thus neither a name nor a body, but rather the oscillation which takes place between them. This movement, which constitutes the event of sense, is both product and cause of these exclusions. And that's all I have, so I'll leave it there. I'm very, very keen to hear what anybody has to say.
Well, thank you, Tim. Now, before we throw the meeting open to questions, comments, and discussion with Tim, I have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existential Society lecture discussion will take place in 1 month's time on Saturday, the 6th of December at this time. And Akiva Quinn will be addressing us on spirituality without religion, which apparently will be a critique of Sam Harris's book on the subject. Now, the Existential Society has weekly Zoom events at this time where we have other groups presenting. And if you want to have a look at the forthcoming events and their topics and to get the Zoom links for them, you'll find everything's on the Existential Society's meetup page. So I've put the link to that in the chat. So for our questions, comments and discussion section, we'll use the raised hand method so we can get you to speak in turn. So if you don't know the raised hand icon, you'll find in the React tab at the bottom of the screen. So Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk, Tim, if I could only understand it all. I was going to say...
I'm here.
When you talked about the skin, it sort of strikes me, there's this fascinating parallel in, what was his name? Wilhelm Reich. I remember reading him back in the glorious 70s. And I remember his concept of the emotional plague when he developed this idea that one day the entire Western world's going to go insane with this emotional plague. Back in the 70s, I've looked around, I thought, they all look all right. What's he talking about? Absolute nonsense. Here I am in the 2020s and the world, as predicted, has gone insane. But I think the interesting parallel with his system of analysis was he criticised Freudianism for wanting to drill through the person to some hidden depth where they could find the dark, spongy stuff, whatever it was. But here's, Reich had the idea that really we approach from the surface first, and we start peeling away the layers, and that there is something significant in all these layers, even the outermost layers. Whereas Freud was going for the depths. It was so 19th century Freud, that the 19th century was always full of the ideas of finding a hidden Atlantis or something. When we find that, we're there. But no, Reich's saying, let's look at the surface. What's going on in the most visible part before we try to go below? I was wondering what you think of that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're on the money, Stephen. Like, this is the same sort of critique, I suppose, like, of a kind of depth psychology. The idea that, the truth is hidden in the depths or something like this. I mean, this presupposes, from a sort of Deleuzean perspective at least, some sort of problematic metaphysics according to which, there is some hidden true identity of things, rather than, maybe the fact that, there are sort of self-evident realities or something like this that exist on the surface that we ought to be sort of more attentive to. And this is where this paradox kind of emerges from, of the surface as precisely the deepest, part of the organism or something like this. I mean, a couple of things to say. One, Deleuze and Guattari certainly really like Wilhelm Reich and often refer to his work in different places. I've not read much of it myself, only a few bits and pieces, but they are certainly admirers of his sort of political stuff as well, the stuff on the psychology of fascism and so on. In terms of how you were characterizing your own experience, since the 1970s and the sort of let's say the hystericization of the social field or something like this. I mean, this is something Lacan says in one of his seminars, right? He says, well, where have all these hysterical people gone, right? So, psychoanalysis begins with the character of the hysteric, right? The gendered, not unproblematic character of, these women, bourgeois Viennese women, people like Anna O, who have these bizarre physical symptoms, right? So, their arms are unable to work, and, they're unable to speak, and so on and so forth. And Freud, sort of inaugurates psychoanalysis by doing something pretty unusual, for all the debates which rage around his sort of patriarchal commitments. He listens to these women, right? I mean, he's convinced that there's something in the speech of these women which is somehow significant. And Lacan at one point sort of meditates on this, and he says, where have all the hysterics gone? It's simply not the case now that people sort of present to psychiatrists. I mean, not often, at least, I suspect. And, their left arm no longer works, or they're unable to speak suddenly overnight, or they speak a different language. I mean, these types of etiologies or symptomologies, which are characteristic of like 19th century hysteria, not even a diagnostic criteria anymore, right? And Lacan says, well, isn't it the case that hysteria has precisely been displaced into the social field? This is where hysteria lies now. Rather than, so, I presume that in very pragmatic terms, if someone wakes up one morning and suddenly they can't move their left arm, they'll go to a neurologist and they'll get an MRI, or they'll Google it, right? And they'll find out pretty quickly either that they've had a stroke or something like this, or that like it's not a thing, right? What they're experiencing, at which point presumably the symptom will resolve. But without that architecture there in the 19th century, you get a very different kind of symptom formation. And it's this kind of sort of phantasmic, if you like, representational symptom formation, which Lacan at least sees as being displaced into social relations by the mid-20th century. Interesting idea there, right? In terms of finally, right, this account of Freud as being dedicated to the depths, right, and finding the kind of hidden truths of things. Certainly, at least, and I'm quite persuaded by this on the basis of my reading to date, Lacan at least is adamant that Freud himself arrives at a kind of surface psychology, and neglects the idea. So once psychoanalysis ultimately, in earnest, realizes that it is an account of language specifically, and the sort of disorders of language. So, it's an account of the meaning of the symptom. So the fact that, the sort of traumatized individual, the psychoanalytic patient who has some recurrent, inexplicable physical sort of symptom, the symptom is a sign, it's a signifier, it's an attempt to express something. But arguably, this kind of transition from a depth psychology to an account of meaning as a surface effect. So the idea that you might have two interacting sort of discourses or languages which, sort of interpenetrate one another, rather than a hidden depth which is coming up, and disordering language. Lacan at least is convinced that that's already there in Freud, and that Freud sort of begins to realize that this is the nature of his project. So there's a shift in Freud from what Freudians call the sort of economic model of the psyche, which you get early on, which is very, very 19th century, right? So it's all about it's conceived in sort of thermodynamic terms, as like the energy of the id is modulated in different ways, turned into the energy of the sort of bound to different signifiers, and turned into in a sort of relatively controlled way, structured into an ego, and so on. And arguably, you shift from a kind of economic depth model to what Freudians tend to call the structural model at some point, in the sort of just before the 1920s, I think. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea that, ultimately psychoanalysis itself already gets here to this account of surfaces. Yeah, I'm not sure if that sort of those are just
it was quite enlightening. Yeah, thank you. I think it was because Nietzsche was the one that started framing a lot of stuff in terms of Darwinian sort of motivations, and Nietzsche was starting to think, well, this self I'm so proud of just seems to be a bit of a mask. I'm he went into the whole idea of power, and the idea that oh my God, I'm just something floating on the surface of a sea of power, and I thought I was, Christianity teaches your essential self. Whereas you're starting to think, oh, what I thought was the essential self is just a surface appearance. Thank you.
He says at one point, I can't remember where, right? Resentment digs out an interior, right? So, so if you're a healthy being, you live on the surface. If you've been frustrated and you're full of poison and hate and so on, you have an interior life. And this is like what Christianity produces ultimately. And it's really sick as far as Nietzsche is concerned.
Thank you.
Claire, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Timothy. I was wondering if I could ask you a question related to Deleuze and his conceptualization of the signifier and the signified, just so I can understand it a little bit better. So from what you're saying, there's sort of in his seeking out the difference between the word and the thing, it's sort of, he's looking for a direct correspondence of some kind between the signifier and the signified. So rather than looking at something like a signifying chain, and if I've understood this properly, it's via the paradox that seems to form when you look for a correspondence between signifier and signified, that nonsense becomes the sort of third part of the tripartite model. If I'm not sure whether I've got that right, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit on that.
That sounds pretty good to me. So I'll offer the perhaps unsatisfying qualification that this is stuff I'm trying to figure out myself, right? Particularly the relationship to sort of structural linguistics. I wouldn't put it in quite the way that you did at the beginning in terms of Deleuze looking for a direct correlation between the signifier and the signified, right? So I suspect that, Deleuze is thinking very much in sort of differential terms, right? So these relations are always differentially composed, and as such, they're always shifting. So I suspect there is no I mean, I think this is implicit in the way that you were phrasing things as well, right? But that, you know, this project of looking for a direct correlation or something like this is doomed to failure, right? In as much as what we have, in as much as there are sensible relations between signifiers and things, is actually a kind of differentially composed set of modulations of nonsense itself, right? It's nonsense which actually, you know, if we dig too deeply, we discover that you know, all these phonemic relations are actually sort of nonsensical ones, which sort of produce this surface effect. So it's precisely the project to sort of get what is the real meaning of a proposition or something like this, or, you know, how is a proposition? I mean, these are the types of questions which had preoccupied so much analytic philosophy of language. You know, what does it mean for a proposition to be true or false, or, you know, etc. And Deleuze, in some respects, sees these as being sort of secondary interest to the project of the kind of real conditions for the genesis of sense. And this is why he turns to psychoanalysis, because it seems, well, here's a very plausible account of how it is that we actually arrive at this kind of differential system. It's less about kind of finding, you know, some adequate or immaculate correspondence between word and thing. It's more about understanding this relation as itself kind of contingent and arbitrary, sort of culturally produced in keeping with a particular sort of symbolic order. And, you know, in terms of the diachronic genesis or the arrival at a sensible order, it's something that begins in the category of nonsense. So if we are attentive enough to, you know, and this is actually, it was really an odd experience because I've been thinking about this a lot. It was an odd experience reading the paper because I found I was quite prone to sort of not the occasional nonsensical sort of stumble, right? And I think this is like, there's something analogous here to so Freud says about parapraxes or slips of the tongue, that as soon as you start talking about parapraxes, you're liable to start making them, which is entirely true, right? I had to give a lecture series on Freud a couple of years ago, and in the lecture on parapraxes, it was astounding how much stuff I started sort of saying accidentally, right? And ditto, right? Once one is, you're sort of baiting the unconscious, right? In this respect. Ditto, once one is attentive to the fact that all one is really doing when one is speaking is making sort of sounds with the body, sort of brute, percussive, etc. noises, right? Using your teeth and your lips and your, you know, etc. You're liable to stop being able to communicate once you're attentive to the fact that this is actually the embodied reality of a signifying system. It really threatens, you know, the sort of efficiency or the closure of that system. So I don't know if I've answered your question at all adequately there, Claire, but I think that initial picture that you kind of sketched out, that accords with my sense of what Deleuze is trying to do. With the exception, go on.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that because I was thinking, so for Deleuze, there's no sort of focus on the signifying chain, sort of, which you sort of start to get with, say, someone like Saussure, which Lacan and it sounds like Deleuze have picked up, or was he also thinking of the signifying?
No, yeah, he's certainly interested in the signifying chain. I suppose the idea here would be, what is the movement precisely which connects terms, right? Or, you know, animates a particular signifying chain. And this would be sense, right? I mean, so in that French sense of direction. So some ontogenetic process, some movement, some you know, unfurling of ultimately nonsense, which produces these kind of chains of chromatic variation or something like this in signifying chains. But that vocabulary is there in logic of sense as well.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Because the only other thing that it got me thinking of is something like and I'll be very brief because I know other people have a question, but Lacan's modal logic in something like L'Interdit, where he really also contemplate, and I've never read Deleuze, so I can't contribute there, but where he contemplates the importance of when he's talking about the accidental, and I wonder whether that has any similarity at all. Or the impossible and the accidental, which he kind of focuses on those other sides of logic. And I wonder whether that had any relationship at all to what Deleuze is talking about with respect to the nonsense.
I mean, are you thinking here of, is this idea of, you know, I mean, there being no accidents ultimately from a certain
goodness, you're asking me some tricky stuff, but I think what happens in L'étourdi is that the focus is really on the impossible and the accidental rather than the sort of necessary and the contingent, which is sort of, I don't know much about philosophy, but I think that the latter is often focused on as philosophy, whereas Lacan really drills into, you know, the thing that continues not to be written. Sort of playing with these ideas as sort of a four-part modal.
Yeah. Look, I don't know if I can say anything too intelligent about that. Suffice it to say that my sense is that for Deleuze, at least, I mean, so Deleuze talks a little bit about the impossible. He's not crazy about the concept of possibility, impossibility, because he reads possibility in terms of basically sort of information theory or something like this, right? In terms of a closed system. So, you know, the possible for Deleuze, is always kind of an impoverished image of the actual, or, you know, what there really is. Plus or minus certain sort of predetermined criteria, whereas what he's interested in is the virtual as opposed to the possible, and the virtual as a kind of genetic condition for actualization, sort of by definition can't resemble what's actual, and this is what's wrong with the possible, right? And so the concept of the impossible likewise sort of is not one that Deleuze necessarily, he uses it occasionally, but it's not a key concept, I think, for Deleuze. In terms of that idea of accidents, it was really interesting. I'll have to think more about it. The status of accident in all of this.
Thank you. You've given me some further reading directions. I really appreciate it. So thanks.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Muri, it's your turn.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please, can you hear me?
Yes,
Am
we
I
can.
audible? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Timothy, for the presentation. It's very deep and philosophical, and it has opened a lot of complex directions. But I have a question. In football, when the ball is exactly on the touchline, it's not fully inside and not fully outside. And that's strange, because in between zone only exists because we draw the line in the first place. So relating this to your point about mind and society, both operating autopoietically, pardon me if I didn't pronounce it well, is the unconscious something real on its own? Or is it just that same kind of residue that only appears because we ourselves separate the mind from the society? Because if we remove the distinction, does the unconscious still exist? Or is it that the unconscious is just a boundary effect produced by our conceptual separation? So I'm just trying to understand if unconscious is an actual active system, or if it's something that only becomes visible because we draw a boundary in theory. Because if it's just a boundary product, then it means the unconscious is not a thing, it's a shadow of the separation we make. Can you help me to speak into this, please? Thank you.
A really good question. And I don't know that I'm going to have a satisfactory answer to it. The football image is really helpful, actually, right? So this is a great example, I think, of something. And so, you know, I'm inclined to read that analogy as expressing something about the nature of a paradoxical element, right? So this is the element which is both sort of inside and outside of the system, which somehow animates the entirety of the system by moving around. So, I mean, you know, so on the one hand, that idea of the football that's on the line and is not yet in the game, but not yet out of the game, I think this is a really good way of thinking about, you know, the status of the paradoxical element in someone like Deleuze or Lacan. You know, this is like analogous to something like the phallus or something like this. But I think even you could sort of push it even further, perhaps, and say that, you know, the ball is sort of, in some sense, never really part of the game, right? I mean, it's the ball doesn't play the game, and yet it's the thing which sort of sets the motion of all of the different players. You know, it's not itself a player, right? But it's that which animates the action of all of the players. And I think in this respect, it's a really helpful image for the type of system or structure and the type of structural element that you know, Deleuze is interested in here. Gosh, in terms of, you're asking questions that are like above my level of competence here. In terms of the unconscious as something, as an active system, I think is the phrase that you used that caught my attention. And whether it's a sort of, so whether it's somehow a line that's drawn by by consciousness, perhaps, or by society, which sort of produces the unconscious as a sort of as a residue or an effect. And I'm tempted, I think. Now, obviously, this is going to depend a little bit on who you ask, right? So, you know, I think the early Freud might be tempted by just that kind of a position, perhaps. Although, not even here, I don't know if I'm qualified to make these claims, right? Certainly, from my perspective, I think it would be more fertile for us to view consciousness precisely in these terms, right? So as a kind of residue or effect of where the real action is, right? Which is, you know, the unconscious. So I'm definitely inclined on this basis, at least personally, to view the unconscious as something like a real active system. And I suspect that it's the conscious mind, which is in some respects epiphenomenal, or you know, has a kind of illusory, I think, dimension. In as much as, right, I mean, the key thing for, you know, going all the way back to Freud really is that human beings are something driven. Right. I mean, you know, it's the drives which animate our activity. Now, you know, a certain modulation of the pleasure principle becomes ultimately a kind of self-reflective, you know, socially sanctioned, conscious, you know, kind of structure or entity. This would be like the ego, which is not the same as consciousness, but, you know, runs sort of parallel with it. But I suspect that these are like after effects or residues of, you know, yeah, where the action is, which is the unconscious, conceived as something very, very real. That's my sense, at least. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yuri, did you wish to respond?
Excuse me. Yes, I was actually looking at it from this perspective. Does it mean that psychoanalysis is actually interpreting the residue of system distinctions and not the system itself?
Well, you know, so if the perspective is, well, I'm not sure that I've understood the question, right? But I mean, in as much as it interprets the unconscious, or it sort of tarries with the unconscious somehow, my sense is that is, you know, psychoanalysis coming to grips with, if you like, you know, the real motive force or something like this. Rather than the set of, you know, habitual, if you like, habitual cliches or deceptions or whatever it might be, which enable the organism to sort of function day to day. That's my sense, at least. But I don't know how well supported it is across, you know. So, I mean, one of the problems with this material, of course, is that I'm reading Deleuze's reading of psychoanalysis, which is itself a kind of somewhat fraught proposition, because Deleuze sort of takes psychoanalysis and does what he likes with it. To a certain extent, he does something creative with it, with, you know, diverse psychoanalytic resources, rather than being in any way a doctrinaire thinker, right? Who, you know, gets what, for instance, Freud believes absolutely correct or something like this. He's also drawing on a number of thinkers like, you know, Lacan or Klein and others. You know, Winnicott is a key reference as well, who are obviously all themselves doing rather heterodox things with Freud. So, we're at a number of kind of layers of remove here, which make it very hard to make sort of definitive claims about, what the nature of the unconscious, for instance, is for Deleuze. Because Deleuze, it should be said, right? Deleuze himself, I mean, this is one of the interesting dimensions of the logic of sense and its, I suppose, subsequent reception, is the fact that Deleuze, shortly after writing this book, teams up with Felix Guattari, and they collaborate on two very famous books, well, more than two, right? But there are two in particular that are very well known, the two volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the first of which, Anti-Oedipus, tended to be received, at least in the Anglophone world, as a kind of critique of Freudianism. And it's not if you read it carefully, right? I mean, so I think it's very easy to inherit that position. And there are criticisms of sort of the tendency towards, I suppose, dogmatism in maybe various psychoanalytic institutions. Contemporary, psychoanalytic associations in the 1960s in France, right? But it's not really a critique of Lacan or of Freud's ideas in the sense of like rejecting these ideas. It's an attempt to sort of extend them. And what's interesting is that it's been read historically precisely as a kind of like scathing critique or rejection of psychoanalysis. And I think that says more about the subsequent destiny of psychoanalysis, right, than it does about Deleuze and Guattari's own attitudes towards it. The fact that psychoanalysis became, at a certain point, with the advent of these sort of newfangled, cognitive behavioral therapies and ego psychology and so on, psychoanalysis came to be quite unfashionable and, considered a bit of a old hat kind of way of looking at the psyche. And I think that this broader sort of cultural intellectual climate led to Anti-Oedipus being interpreted in a particular way, for instance. Now, that leaves logic of sense, which is just the most explicitly sort of positive, if you like, engagement with psychoanalysis, in a really weird place, because its psychoanalytic content has been repressed in all kinds of strange ways. So even the English translation, in the French, the subtitle of The Logic of Sense is A Psychoanalytic Detective Story, which is a wonderful subtitle. In translation into English, and this is no, I don't mean to offend the august translators of the book, right? But it's translated as a psychological detective novel, which is like just a remarkable misrepresentation or repression of something, right? It seems to me. And I can only sheet that down to a broader hostility towards psychoanalysis in sort of contemporary American culture, it seems to me. At the time that it was translated pretty early for Deleuze in the 1990 or thereabouts. So things have changed a bit, not much maybe. Anyway, sorry, I don't know if I've answered that question, but.
Philip, go ahead.
Hi. You're in an intellectual tradition that is unfamiliar to me. I don't. I'm assuming that you're in the continental tradition. So I don't. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I had to ask ChatGPT a lot. I'm like very confused about what you're saying. So my question may be kind of basic here. I take that we start with Kant's distinction between the noumenon and phenomenon, and I take that you are anti-Kantian, and that we do know something about the noumenon, and that source of that noumenon is mind, psychic. And then what bifurcate in that from that position is that you could have something like panpsychos, cosmic mind, prototype panpsychos. You could, but potentially you might think that the whole cosmos is one mind, in which case the question then becomes, what is the world made up of one mind versus many minds? I'm assuming that you also do not believe in the subject-object distinctions, just like the Buddha. Um, um, and because your emphasis is on the psychic, you talk a lot about things like Freud. I mean, you have not talked about Jung, but you have used his terminology like the collective unconscious. There lies things like things like sages, warriors, blah blah blah. Um, I don't know what your view is, mathematics in this whole schema. Do you think math is just a cosmic mind contemplating this mathematical objects? Do you think that the universe is one giant wave function that is taking the Schrödinger's equation as ontic instead of epistemic? I don't know. I'm a little bit confused, but can you ground me into what you're talking about?
Sure. I mean, a lot of questions there, right? And I mean, first thing to say is, yes, I probably should have offered this kind of qualifier at the beginning that, this is really like technical exegesis that I'm doing here. And so it is, it is operating at a certain level of abstraction that, I think presupposes a bit of familiarity with certain concepts and so on. So I hope on that basis it didn't feel like lost time for you, right? To just hear, a bunch of kind of jargon that, maybe doesn't ground in anything very concrete. I can certainly try and do a bit of that now. Look, it's funny, right? It's funny the way that, and maybe ChatGPT's played a role here. I'm not sure, but it's funny how perceptions differ, I suppose, in this way. Because, I mean, I see this as, on the one hand, profoundly Kantian in some sense, the project here. Right? So I wouldn't say that I'm anti-Kantian. I sort of view this, particularly Luhmann's project, but I think also Deleuze's in a way, as so when you ask me, for instance, about the terms like the collective unconscious, which is it's not a term I'm all that fond of myself, right? Or if the universe is a wave function or things like this. I mean, I couldn't tell you, right? I mean, in a sense, the project here, as I see it, is much more modest and epistemological than that, right? It's about what it's possible to know. So in this sense, there is a kind of, I suppose, a psychical emphasis, right? And people read Deleuze, it should be said, as endorsing a kind of panpsychism. I'm not so sure about that myself. I'm thinking about this in very much, so rather than in terms of the psyche, psychoanalysis, for instance, for me is useful as a way of talking about the social. So the way in which communities, so when I'm thinking about sense, I'm thinking about the ways in which communities precisely make sense. So individuals make sense to one another. So, questions of meaning. So, I'm thinking here in sort of much more modest, I suppose, epistemological terms, right? Rather than trying to think about the noumenal thing in itself. So it seems to me that, all we can say about this is why I conceive of it as a Kantian sort of project, right? Well, all we can really say about the noumenal, thing in itself is that we can't know it in itself, right? And that non-knowledge can only appear, so it seems to me, in the domain of sense. So in language, for instance, or in thought, conceived as some kind of sensible, which is to say intrasubjective social sort of process. So this is the level. I don't know if this makes sense at all, but this is the level that I'm sort of interested in, rather than necessarily, albeit I grant that it's sort of in the background inevitably, sweeping metaphysical description, I should say. That's less what I'm concerned with, at least in this paper, right? And this kind of research. More what I'm interested in is what happens when we think and when we speak to one another. These seem to me to inevitably be, and this is why Luhmann, I think, is really illuminating, not necessarily, grand sweeping Hegelian sort of instances of the universe contemplating itself or something like this, but precisely like just useful things for us as a certain type of living creature to do. So in this sense, I see everything that I've just spoken about here as being profoundly naturalistic, like in the sense of, you know, natural sciences and so on, right? Describing like the type of being that, you know, the type of animal, if you like, that human beings are. Well, they seem to be, among other things, like a sense-using animal. So they communicate distinctions to one another. They make distinctions in their environment. The medium in which this distinction and this communication takes place is sense. It seems as though, as such, their world is one of sense. And they can't think anything that's outside of that world of sense other than as nonsense, if this makes sense. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions at all, right? I've not read a whole heap of Jung, but I tend to follow Freud here, right? On the Jung-Freud showdown, right? Where Freud says the idea of a collective unconscious is like a nonsensical idea. Sorry, go on.
Your idea. So okay, that certainly helps me a lot, because you're not talking about the noumena. You are very strictly neo-Kantian in the sense that you still believe that the world in itself is unknowable, and that what you're dealing with is really trying to make sense of the social world through meaning. Maybe you put it in psychological terms to understand the social world in those terms. Is that right?
That's much closer to how I see things. Yes, except I'd push back. So I'm, you know, I suppose I'm not a Kantian in the sense that I don't believe that the world is unknowable. I suppose the position that I'm committing myself to, at least in this paper, is that the world is only knowable through the medium of sense. And this is the important thing to be attentive to. So it's not quite the same type of claim, and this is probably where I would depart from like a kind of strict Kantianism. But nevertheless, you know, I see it as an epistemological project. And what I wanted to emphasize was, if you want good descriptions of the universe, probably ask a scientist. I don't know if I emphasized that enough, right? But this is not a kind of, I hope, doesn't come across as like the project of a kind of naive idealism or relativism or something, like our minds just create reality or something like this. That's not at all the direction that I see these ideas as tending in.
Okay. So strictly epistemological, strictly about how we understand each other. But you talk about coupled systems, right? At least I asked ChatGPT about the Luhmann, right? It talks about, you know, what is it, autopoietic system as being a structural system, structural coupling system. I take, for example, a country or institution as having many different dimensions, like legal, political, economic. Take, for example, in a year where the economics are not that good, we might have a different political system because people rebel. Is that what is the usefulness of what you're saying in helping us understand, you know, social systems like countries, institutions? What positive point that you're trying to make here? Are you saying that these different systems interact in a way? How are you trying to teach us how to conceptualize the social as many different interacting components, or is it better to forget about that and envision is nothing more like kind of like a field, and that the only thing that matters is the differentials between points in this field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of string of questions there, right? Which, you know, I don't know if I'm able to answer each of them sort of specifically. I mean, one that jumped out to me, because it's a question that I ask myself fairly often, right? What's the use? What's the use of this activity? You know, and I don't have a good answer to that, right? I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of how we can use it to approach precisely the question of autopoiesis. So, you know, the idea would be, I suppose, at least in Luhmann, that, you know, in as much as philosophers think about the universe, we need to jettison the somewhat quaint idea that they are just trying to get at some impersonal truth of the matter, right? Rather, what they're doing is they're involved in some sort of process of precisely self-creation. So philosophy, for instance, is concerned with the production of philosophical statements, something like this, right? Rather than actually getting to the heart of anything that's not philosophy. And I must admit, I'm somewhat persuaded by this way of seeing things, just as kind of, I suppose, descriptive. Interesting to note, Luhmann, his project is really an odd one, right? And he began as a bureaucrat in the West German public service. I don't know if anyone's worked in an environment like this, right? But he found he worked in an office that had absolutely no purpose other than just perpetuating its own activity, right? It didn't solve any problem, like in the kind of vast state bureaucracy. It's just like, well, we need to do another project that proves that our office like has a purpose for being here. And maybe this is the autobiographical contaminating the theoretical in a problematic way, but he sort of makes this point that, well, like modernity is increasingly characterized by systems which sort of close themselves off in this way. So you get, for instance, right, once upon a time, you know, you had the prince or the pharaoh or whoever it might be, who was simultaneously a religious, a legal, and a kind of martial figure, right? Gradually in modernity, you get this hiving off of operationally closed autopoietic systems. So you get a legal system, which is distinct from, you know, post-Treaty of Westphalia, distinct from a theological system in the church, which is itself distinct from, you know, an economic system and so on. And that this kind of functional differentiation of systems depends on operational closure, which is to say it depends on each of these systems developing a set of terms, a vocabulary, with which it speaks to itself about its own activity. And can no longer, so people often make this criticism of academics, for instance, like, you know, why do these people close themselves off in ivory towers and study these ridiculously obscure, specific sort of areas of knowledge which nobody else can understand? And Luhmann would offer, well, this is precisely the tendency of kind of modernity towards increased differentiation of operationally closed sense-using systems, right? And that this is, you know, a sociological thing that he's trying to, sociological observation that he's trying to make. I'm excavating from that project the account of sense, which it presupposes. And in order to do this, we need to go to, you know, Deleuze, which is Luhmann's chief source in thinking about and speaking about what sense is, how sense is sort of constituted. Now, when we come to use Deleuze, so you used a phrase which was interesting to me. You said, so it's a strict epistemology. And I suspect I gave that impression, right, in what I said previously. I mean, I just point out that, you know, from a Deleuzean perspective, such a thing as a strict epistemology is kind of impossible, right? Because any epistemology is going to presuppose a set of kind of metaphysical commitments. And we can't necessarily, so all philosophy is a kind of metaphysics, you know, for Deleuze, really. We can't hive off different branches of philosophy in this kind of neat way from his perspective. Nevertheless, I mean, what I'd like to emphasize, I suppose, is I'm interested less in, you know, describing the nature of the universe, I suppose, more in describing, well, precisely how are we able to make sense to one another? And what does it mean to say that we're doing so? This is the level at which the questions, I suppose, that I'm interested in are located. I don't know if that clarifies it all.
Well, I take, for example, I still want to go into something that is practical. When you think about a society and think about how, you know, we have different, you know, parts of society communicating with other parts of society. But I would imagine that as a country, you still have some sort of like a CEO, like a president or a party, right? That sets the agenda of how you go, you know, how to run a society to achieve some sort of goal. Like maybe, you know, or if you're a company, you know, you want to optimize shareholder value, you want to, you know, make more money for your shareholders. There are goals, and that the whole system is in the service of that goal, right? You know, like John Locke talks about, you know, the natural law and how society ought to be ruled by, you know, reason and the natural law. But that presupposes that there is such a thing as natural law to begin with that guides society in a certain direction. It can't just be all kind of self-referential, self-referential, right? Because if it is so, then you have a corrupt society that sustains itself through corrupt means, and surely not all society is equivalent. The society that cohere with intuition, like the good, the Neoplatonic idea, the good society is better than societies that don't optimize it. A company that optimizes shareholder value is superior to a company that does not. So it cannot just be all equivalent and self-referential, because like they are not in the same plane. A shitty company just talk to itself. A good company talk to itself. But a good company that actually does things in the world that maximizes shareholder value and produce great, awesome products. You see what I'm saying? Thanks.
Yeah, I do. I mean, you know, we're a little bit not stuck, but I suppose, you know, we're a little bit hamstrung by the fact that we're dealing with two different projects here, right? So on the one hand, I mean, Luhmann sees what he's doing as sociology, right? Which is to say, it's in some sense, it's not a normative. So the question of what makes a good company is like not an interesting, in terms of questions of value, is not really the type of question that he's trying to answer, right? He might be able to, or interested in answering, well, what makes a good company in the 21st century, for instance? But that would be a sociological sort of descriptive question, right? About, you know, the conditions for goodness or badness in a particular society. So in this sense, I mean, in terms of this account of operational closure, it aspires at least to be sort of descriptive, as opposed to, you know, it's not saying, and isn't it bad that society's gone in this direction, or wouldn't it be better if, you know, there was a more sort of objective bird's eye view perspective. Now, Deleuze, I think there's going to be a different, you know, set of answers there, because I think Deleuze is always militating in one particular direction or another, just in terms of, you know, corruption and the self-referential nature of institutions and so on. I mean, maybe I'm not the right person to commentate on this. I work at a university. I mean, it's hard to imagine a more corrupt organization that's less interested in any other objective than perpetuating its own existence, rather than, for instance, educating or, you know, contributing to a society or anything like this. I mean, the parameters which govern the way in which a university works today seem to be exclusively to do with this kind of nihilistic managerial self-perpetuation of the institution, right? Regardless of anything else it might achieve or not achieve. The goal is just to keep on keeping on. And from this perspective, this account of sort of operational closure and sort of functional differentiation in modern societies seems really, really on the money to me, it should be said. Like up to and including, so Luhmann differentiates himself from Marx and from a Marxist analysis, in as much as, well, Marx is, you know, so he claims, this is like a really 19th century idea, the idea that there might be one universal criterion which determines the process of social organization, so the economy. And it's worth just kind of flagging the extent to which, like, so again, just to go to the example that I'm familiar with, universities, like they do the most bizarrely actually self-defeating things in terms of their competitiveness on the market, right? Or their actual profitability in the service of a kind of performance of profitability or something like this, right? Which, you know, is absolutely autopoietic, right? So, you know, this is just a roundabout way of saying that, or, you know, for instance, a Marxist would say, well, surely the role of government is like to, you know, make sure that capital is protected from the proletariat or whatever it might be. And it's worth just kind of looking at how often actually government is involved in precisely pursuing its own ends, even when they are contradictory to, you know, the objectives of big business or something like this. So I suspect that, you know, this account of functional differentiation of sort of modern and postmodern, if you like, societies is really onto something from my perspective as description. But that sociological stuff is less what I'm interested in here. I'm more interested in, as I say, like, how is it that, you know, I mean, it's like really old-timey philosophical problem. How is it that I presume that you can understand the words that I say? That's what's interesting to me. And I think that both Luhmann and Deleuze have interesting things to say about this problem. Yeah, maybe, look, I see there's a bunch of other questions, so yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, the whole idea of exploring the depths, but an interesting point, I was looking at one particular philosopher who was a Marxist, unfortunately, but he was going on about Plato's, definition of governments and how there was an evolution. A government always starts off with some legendary hero who becomes a god. He creates an aristocratic order, and they're the rulers, and they have to depend on other warriors at some stage, so you get the timocracy. But for us in the West, that was our Middle Ages. We had the aristocrats and the timocracy, which had all the grandest ideas of daring do as their value system and all that. Of course, the interesting thing is, of course, money came into it. The merchants started to become powerful. The capitalist appears, and naturally they form oligarchies. A typical example is the Venetian Republic, the Dutch Republic. They call themselves republics, but they're actually oligarchies. Swiss Republic. And they're quite progressive materially. We start to lose a sense of the old spiritual values, and we start to get all these much more material values. But of course, the capitalists, to protect themselves from the aristocrats, start to enforce rights in the laws to protect themselves, who are the rich and the wealthy, and there's a trickle down. And of course, they have to replicate this to some extent, even with the poorest individual. The poorest individual has rights. So eventually the oligarchy develops into democracy. We have a broader sort of equality, perhaps some of our modern socialism. But what happens, and this is what you're pointing to, is eventually you end up with a sort of a centrifugal effect, where once what was a very narrowly defined society goes into all these different areas. Yep. I mean, Batman was a joke in the 1960s with all these crazy villains. And then later on, everybody seems to be taking them seriously, like this is the new normal. And so you end up with all these various groups in this sort of centrifugal society that are all trying to become the head. They all want to be the ruler. The stamp collectors, if they still exist, they want to become the ruler, and the gay stamp collectors will separate and form their own group. And naturally, we all want it all for ourselves. And of course, this is why our democracy is falling to bits. Classically, the Greeks said, for example, people will sell their votes for material gain. The guy comes along and says, "I'll feather your nest," they'll vote for him. And of course, this isn't the best choice. And because the vast majority worship democracy, even though the Greek philosophers said, hang on, democracy's not so great. But now it's the byword for good, and they can't grasp that it's falling to bits in front of their eyes. They still worship it. And I saw this a few years ago when I started to become aware of this extreme split between the political parties in the US. And I couldn't grasp it. I thought, nah, this isn't my childhood. Everyone was all for one and one for all. And then I read history, and history says, yes, this is where you're going. And I realised, of course, what follows the democracy is the tyranny, because society becomes so split apart. They all want to be king, that one ring has to rise to rule them all. And I thought, well, I had no idea. I was looking at Donald Trump and I thought, nah, can't be him. And then it turns out The Simpsons was right after all. So,
they always are in the end.
Sorry?
They always are The Simpsons in the end.
Well, this is the thing. They can't grasp it. Really, Donald Trump is just the beginning of what happened to the Roman Republic.
Mm.
It became so divided and so fretted as to where they're all going that you just needed one lunatic to run the insane asylum or some semblance of order. And I could see this the same thing in the Roman Republic. You had wannabe emperor after wannabe emperor, so finally you got one that made it stick. And of course, Julius Caesar gets killed by these constitutional diehards, only to cause an even more massive civil war than had been occurring in the past. As one historian said, we worship these conspirators like they are some of the smartest men in history, and yet John Worry said they were also extremely stupid men in, knocking off Julius Caesar. But this is where Western civilization is going, to my mind. And of course, everybody else is going to say, it's the democracy, but not everybody can be king. That's the thing. I'm quite amazed that modern thinkers don't know their Greek philosophy and couldn't see this coming. So I was just wondering what you think about all that.
I mean, there's a lot there. Work backwards. I mean, it's yes. I mean, there's something about. I mean, so why has Trump not read The Republic? I mean, it's a kind of.
I think they've informed him by now, and he's figured out he's Julius Caesar.
Well, I'm reminded of a cut here. So there's there's kind of, what is that cliche of Churchill's that's worth trotting out, I suppose, whenever this topic comes up. Of course, democracy is the worst political system other than all the rest of them, right? I mean, and I suppose I'm sort of committed to some version of that personally. I'm reminded of one of Lacan's little sound bites, right? That, a commoner who thinks he's a king is mad, right? But a king who thinks he's a king is sort of even madder at some level, right? Which is to say that, if there's a kind of actual identification with the symbolic role or an over-identification or something like this, then there's something sort of deficient about you, at least from this perspective. Look, to the broader account that, I mean, it was quite a Marxist account that you gave there, that kind of historical account that you sort of offered, right, of changing modes of production or something like this, right, as such proliferating, a certain image of universal rights and so on. I suppose, the question becomes from the perspective of someone like Luhmann. So again, I suppose to return us to the problem of sense, the question becomes, well, so not even, and then this is the deflationary sort of attitude I hope came through in my discussion with Philip just before. The question for Luhmann would not even be what, metaphysically speaking, is the driver of this historical process. Rather, it would be, from the point of view of sociology, how are we, if we concede that what we're engaged in is basically a self-descriptive process, how is it useful for sociology currently to describe the historical motivations of that process? So very modest, very sort of, if you like, epistemological approach.
And I could give you something there.
Well, maybe let me offer my thought, and then I'd love to hear it. Luhmann at least is going to say, and let's bear in mind both The Simpsons and the fact that Trump, like, it gets lost sometimes, I suspect, is a televisual figure, right? I mean, Luhmann's answer is going to be not the economy. This is not what makes, this is, he's not a Marxist in this kind of orthodox sense. Rather, it's an increase in the complexity of means of communication, which is to say, an increasing complexity of the types of vocabularies which are deployed in the context of sense-using systems, right? So you've got things like media, you've got things like literate populations, you've got things like, television and so on. And it's this massive increase in the proliferation, basically, of information across societies. So yes, I think the Platonic diagnosis of democracy here is pertinent, right? As something which, at least for Plato, inevitably plunges into tyranny by virtue of, the manipulability. I mean, it's all there in Plato. It's kind of like unnerving to read the passages in the Republic where he talks about the fact that rich men can simply buy votes, and this is inevitably where democracy sort of goes. I mean, the diagnostic power of that text is pretty, uncanny. But I think, we can meaningfully understand these political developments in terms of sense, right? The fact that we live in societies which bombard us with increasing sort of amounts of information. So there are increasing, if you like, amounts of states of affairs which are perceptible or sensible to us as individuals. And concomitant with this is an increase in the amount of nonsense as well that we sort of have to sort of filter and organize. Now, bear in mind that for both Deleuze and Luhmann, sense is a functional reduction of complexity. They'll say this in different ways, right? But it's a reduction of a situation which is far, far too complex. This is the Kantianism, incidentally, as well, when we bear in mind that for Kant, right, we're flooded with sense data, the information reduces what comes in and enables it as such to kind of cohere in categories. So that must be a person, that must be a dog, etc. Right? But actually what we're kind of confronted with is like a kind of infinity of sense data, something like this, right? And I think it's worth thinking about living in a mediatic society, a society where we're bombarded with information. The power of effective politics consists precisely in being able to simplify, right? Simplify that barrage of information. So what Trump does, like, and he's not alone here, what all of these kind of tyrannical figures do, these authoritarian figures, is reduce what is ultimately a kind of infinitely complex reality of a kind of globalized economy and supply chains and so on, right? To a very, very simple narrative about an other, usually, right, who is, looks different to you, who is coming to take what's yours by right or something like this. And this functions through a kind of like, ironic disavowal, right? It's like, I suspect that most people most of the adherents to these ideologies don't actually believe them, right? It's just that this is obviously a functionally useful construction in sense, a useful narrative ultimately for the reduction and distillation and, for my comprehension ultimately of a reality which is far, far too complex for me to kind of adequately think. And I suspect that this is increasingly what politics looks like in sort of information societies or media societies. You need someone who can simplify it all for you. And this is, I think, the appeal of these figures, among other things.
I was going to say that the Marxist element, which this guy put into this image of the evolution of these governments, was when you look at it, of course, Marx said this himself, you go back to the Middle Ages and people lived in communities. Not that they liked each other, but they had to live in a community to survive. And there was, it was a face-to-face experience. And, Marx lamented the loss of this because when the capitalists showed up, society became a bit more mechanical. And the natural unit became the extended family. And when democracy showed up, the natural unit left the extended family, became the nuclear family. And of course, in the post-democratic age, the natural unit, the couples are splitting apart and you end up with the one-parent family. And this is the effect of the alienation. Technology has made that possible. All the technology which is around me today makes it possible for me to just live on my own. I've got all this machinery in society, which is almost faceless, granting me the stuff that I need. And this just wasn't possible in the Middle Ages. And this is, so we're living in a highly atomized society, of course, and you would have heard that term before. So I was just wondering for a little bit of an input on that aspect. But it's a luxury to live an atomized life as well. You want an extended family that's got its good points. You've also got that annoying aunts that you want to keep away from in the extended family. And then you find, the wife is annoying. Just split from her. A little atom on my own.
So until you discover that oneself is annoying, right? At which point then you realize you're really screwed.
Claire, your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. As you spoke more, I was able to understand, particularly when you said you're interested in psychoanalysis for looking at the social. And I wonder, I've sort of got two questions that come from that, and I'll be quite quick. So as long as alongside the idea that you can get what is grammatically correct, but nevertheless nonsensical in meaning. And I think you gave the example of the married bachelor walk down the street or something like that. Is there any correspondence in the idea of nonsense with a kind of chaos? For example, you wake up and you see on the news that there's been this horrible, nonsensical crime that's committed that seems to be just, a joy of violence and chaos. Is that got any relation to the concept of nonsense? And the second question I had, following on from nonsense, has that, and I think you were talking about the idea of knowing the world in terms of sense, and also how it is with the language component of that. The phenomenon of fake news in terms of all the information that's available, does that also play into nonsense? I mean, in some ways you've answered it. It means sense being a sort of functional reduction of the complex, but I wonder how the fake news sits in there. So my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I don't immediately have, I mean, in terms of that second question about fake news, I don't immediately have an answer. My sense is that in as much as it makes sense, right? So, if somebody says that, I don't know what nonsensical thing, that Rupert Bear has been elected president of the United States or whatever, right? I mean, it makes sense, right? I understand it. It's not a nonsense statement. It's just, arguably it's an untrue one or something like this, right? And this would be the level at which maybe analytic philosophy might want to sort of interrogate that proposition. So this is the very famous work of someone like Bertrand Russell on questions about, the bald king of France, etc. Right? If we want to map every kind of meaningful sentence onto a truth value of either true or false, like what are we to make of sentences like the current king of France is bald? Well, there isn't one, right? So this is the idea that there must be a sort of beneath the surface grammar, there's a kind of underlying grammar of a sentence like this. So actually what the proposition entails is there is a king of France and he is bald, and then we can, correctly, I suppose, identify that sentence as a false proposition or something like this. This is the type of exercise that Deleuze sees as a bit of a waste of time, and not really meaningfully telling us very much about what it means for something to make sense. And I suspect, right, I mean, if we're not going to be committed to a kind of strictly denotative or referential image of sense, so, a sensible sentence is one that correctly points at something, then we're going to have to look at the social. So sense is determined through sort of intersubjective processes, social practices of some kind, our entry into a symbolic order, something like this. But then, of course, for Deleuze, right, who's doing a kind of very radical type of philosophy, right, which, takes certainly the idea of common sense as a kind of very problematic one. So, it should be worth it's worth just kind of flagging that a lot of philosophy, so people like René Descartes and so on, make these really foundational claims on the basis of common sense, right? So Descartes says very famously that nothing is more evenly distributed than common sense, right? So there's this kind of universal capacity for thinking ultimately, right? And this is what we can appeal to when we're doing philosophy. And it goes right back to Aristotle, actually, right? Who had the endoxic method, right? So if you look at, the Nicomachean Ethics or, the sort of ancient texts of Aristotle's, what he'll do basically is, he'll, at the start of every sort of chapter, he'll go, look, this chapter's about what it means to live a good life. If you ask these people, that's what a good life is. If you go and ask the tradespeople, that's what a good life is. If you ask children, not that he does actually, but if you ask all these different groups, right, what we've got to look for is the point at which these different perspectives overlap. And that's probably the truth, right? And this is what he calls his endoxic method, right? So we can rely on common sense, if you like, to, find the truth of the matter. And it's precisely the truthfulness which, makes it a shared conception. This is what Deleuze hates in philosophy, right? This is like why philosophy is a kind of conservative sort of undertaking historically, as far as he's concerned, is its preoccupation with, what a given social order has determined that we ought to think. So common sense immediately becomes this kind of suspect proposition. And this is why you've got this kind of valorization of the productivity of nonsense, right? And an understanding of the fact that, well, sense seems to appear in this other form as well, this kind of paradoxical form, this form that can't ever be fully contained or exhausted by a given distribution of sort of common sense, but which nevertheless insists or persists somehow. And this shows the fact, this is a kind of like politically, I mean, he connects paradox to, for instance, revolutionary politics, right, in logic of sense, because this shows that a given distribution of sense or a given social order depends upon its necessary sort of foreclosure of that which is outside or nonsensical. But this nevertheless insists or persists and continues to disrupt a given social order. At the psychoanalytic level, I mean, this is where the psychoanalytic account of an infant who gradually sort of enters a symbolic order, but nevertheless experiences that entry as kind of perennially traumatic, and that symbolic order as extimate or something like this, right? As always kind of something that the subject is both inside and external to. This also expresses this kind of contingency of a given distribution of sense, right? The fact that sense always kind of creates a total world, but in so doing, it sort of necessarily has to account for everything that it excludes somehow. Does this make sense at all?
Oh, we seem to have lost. Go ahead, Stephen.
I haven't got my hand up.
Oh, it's okay. My mistake. It was Claire who asked the question. Go ahead, Claire.
Yes, thank you, Timothy. It does, because it's the kind of, I mean, the negation of non refers us back to the term anyway. So in some ways, it's kind of implicit, as in the functional reduction of the complex could be sense or it could be nonsense. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Well, I just, Deleuze is like, really emphatic about the fact that one of the problems here is that we talk about sense in sense. And, I note the fact that I constantly go, does this make sense after I say something, right? I mean, I think this is like exemplary of, exactly the problem that Deleuze is interested in here, right? The fact that, we're trying to make sense, right? And this process of trying to make sense is always menaced by the fact that it's possible to make nonsense as well. But that, we need to see this. The ethical task for Deleuze is precisely to see nonsense as an excess or as something like productive, and not as a kind of a negation. Yeah, as you say.
Thank you.
John, go ahead.
Yes, I've got a couple of points about depth psychology. With consciousness, it seems that Freud and Jung both were happy with the concept of ego consciousness, which was awareness using common sense and the senses, of course, and perception of empirical realities. But when it comes to the unconscious, it seems that Freud is often associated with the id, and of course also then with the unconscious as a consequence. And that's the physical instincts over against Jung, who is concerned with the two levels, the personal, which is an unconscious, which is got to by personal features, dreams and experiences like that. And of course then the collective with groups, and it's more cultural issues. He's dealing with archetypal cultures and images and impulses. Now, I'm just wondering whether you could see similarities actually between Freud's id, or how do that? Really, the question is how would depth psychology relate Freud's id and then Jung's collective personal and collective consciousness?
Yeah, sure. Good questions. I don't know Jung all that well. I've not really read a great deal of Jung's work. I'm fairly persuaded by the critical remarks, though, that Freud makes about the idea of a collective unconscious, right? So, and incidentally, this is interesting to me in as much as it opens up the extent to which, like, psychoanalysis is. I'm quite interested in the extent to which psychoanalysis is, like, in its DNA, a kind of liberal enterprise, right? An atomic individualist enterprise, right? So the idea that the unconscious of each individual is formed in a kind of radical specificity, right? So, things will only mean what they mean, or terms will only have the sense that they have for you, which is why we can never kind of write like a dictionary of dream symbolism or something like this, right? This is precisely where Freud, as I understand it, departs from the Jungian idea of like a collective unconscious or cultural archetypes or what have you. Because like I have a set of experiences with dogs, right? Which is such that like dogs to me mean, XYZ. You will have an irreducibly different experience of dogs. And we're just not going to get anywhere, clinically speaking, if we treat these terms or these concepts as having the same sense for either of us. So I tend to this is why I suppose I tend to sort of align myself without having, I should say, a bit of a Philistine move, not having really read much Jung. This is why I tend to be sort of a bit skeptical about some of the claims that seem to come from the Jungian sort of perspective. Look, in terms of the broader question about depth psychology, I mean, I think it's interesting. So again, my sense is, and this is like a reading which is inflected very much by Lacan, my sense is that Freud himself sort of moves away from a kind of depth or an ego psychology, right? So even in papers like, I think it's on narcissism, right? Or, certainly like post Beyond the Pleasure Principle, you sort of get a break in Freud's work or a shift in Freud's work, according to which the ego becomes like just a kind of dumb object. Like it's a structurally necessary part of the psychic apparatus, but it's not as if it's like the little guy with the controls who's like driving everything, or it's the main bit, and that the task of the analyst is to inveigh on the side of the ego, and so on. Like this is a formulation that you get occasionally, like in the introductory lectures and elsewhere, but my sense is that it sort of falls away in favor of, so, I think it's on narcissism. Really, you get an account of like, narcissism is like backwards looking, right? In as much as it always involves a kind of love of what one was, right? Which is to say the ego is this kind of like, this object of scraps and traces and leftovers of various sort of identities that we've supposed that we've had in the past, right? Rather than actually, so in this sense, it's an object. It's a particular type of love object, which we sort of cathect, but it's not actually, what we truly are or something like this. And so I suspect, and so this is obviously an idea that Lacan really develops. There's one of the seminars where he talks about the fact that, the ego is kind of like, it's like it's an object like a table, right? I mean, it's just there. It's kind of necessary for us to have a certain degree of sort of psychic stability, but it's not ultimately what we truly are. It's just part of the sort of system, something like this. My sense is that is already there in Freud. And it's certainly, to my mind, so the other thing that Lacan says, of course, is that, well, the ego is like, generally tends to be one of the chief obstacles to like psychoanalytic treatment, right? Because, people, think they are a certain type of thing or person and they want to be like that, but it's actually, the kind of desperate attempt to pretend to be that type of thing or identify with that set of identifications, which causes them to become ill or to suffer. In fact, it's a kind of like denial of, a certain reality of their desire, something like this. That to me, both for, I suppose, personal and professional philosophical reasons, sounds like a much more reliable account or a much more persuasive account, particularly of the way in which, I suppose, our identities seem fairly obviously sort of culturally synthesized in this problematic way, such that, we take our interests to be things which, are not necessarily in our interests. And it seems to me that this skepticism in sort of later Freudian and certainly Lacanian psychoanalysis about the ego, the centrality of the ego, really captures that that important sort of insight. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, John, but.
Yeah, I was going to add a question about Lacan, but you have answered it. A final point I want to make is the problem with conscious and unconscious. It's funny that the unconscious is actually, there's an element of unwilled consciousness going on. And so it's not really a good term. Some people are using the word pre-conscious, so that they're still saying that in a way, some sort of consciousness, not quite like ego consciousness, rational, what you're talking about, with using the senses, but it's a pre-consciousness. So it's still, but instead of being a willed consciousness, it becomes an unwilled consciousness. I'm just wondering what you think of that use of the term pre-conscious rather than unconscious.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all shifts, right? In Freud, I mean, this is like one of, I think that, like, it's funny to me, and this goes again to those remarks I made earlier about the sort of subsequent reception of psychoanalysis. Like, it's funny to me that Freud is sometimes read as this dogmatic character, because like one of the things that seems to be characteristic to me of his work is this constant willingness to revise, like on the basis of precisely the people that he's listening to. In the context of like the clinic, and so all of these terms sort of shift as far as I can tell across his work. The pre-conscious, I mean, yeah. So at one point, it's kind of characterized, I think, in the interpretation of dreams, characterized as a kind of censor, but I tend to understand it just as so. Again, a kind of in a function that's related to language as, simply, so for instance, the English language is like, is part of our pre-conscious apparatus if we're English speakers. So I can, I can say, well, what's the name of the street that you grew up on? I mean, you can recall that, right? I mean, it wasn't conscious, right? It was in your pre-conscious, which is to say it was in a domain of the psyche which remained accessible to you, even though it wasn't explicitly conscious. The other thing that Freud says, which like further complicates this, is, and I don't know if I'll do justice to this idea, right? But which is like perhaps a case in point, is that there's conscious material, right, of various kinds that we are nevertheless, in some sense, like not in control of, or not able to sort of necessarily have a kind of transparent relationship to. Now, what's weird about that is, now that I've said that, I can't remember what exactly they are, what an example would be, which of course is itself perhaps an example of what I'm talking about here. But this is a roundabout way of saying that, these distinctions, I mean, Luhmann would say that these distinctions, unconscious, pre-conscious, conscious, they're always operational distinctions, right? Rather than like describing set in stone metaphysical realities or something like this, right? We've always got to ask, well, which unconscious, whose, in what contexts, for our purposes, what is the pre-conscious, for instance? And suddenly, I think when we're asking questions like formulated in this way, I suspect we're asking we're going to get a far more rigorous kind of answer, I suspect. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's some excellent insights there. Thank you.
No probs.
DLJ, your turn.
Thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Super, thank you. Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I've got the feeling this is one of those presentations in a few months' time, I'm suddenly going to wake up in the night going, I get it. But right now,
I hope so.
I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a psychoanalyst. So I was trying to map the language I don't understand onto something I do understand. So when you said systems theory, I sort of perked up a bit. I went, ooh, that's my thing. So I was trying to work. Okay, so sense obviously is a key thing. I was hearing sense in three senses, as in input. Well, sense, system, or input, process, output, right? So I was hearing in terms of sense data, input, making sense or having made sense of something, presumably is an output or an outcome, maybe. And then you also use is it the French translation of sense into direct? So that sounds like the process side. So you kind of got all three bits there. And I was thinking, okay, I like this. Also, you mentioned information theory, which was the Shannon definition of reducing uncertainty, which of course is what humans, well, all organisms are trying to do by processing information. So I think I'm with you so far. You can tell me if you're wrong. Plus all the stuff about signals from noise, basically, right? So we're using packed phonemes from blah in order to be able to communicate with each other, which we then turn into cultural artifacts so we can speak jargon, like the young people do. And of course, garbage in, garbage out, right? So the garbage out part, I guess, is the nonsense, right? Which is, I guess, is what I'm talking now by talking to excess. So let me get to the question. I think, did I get any of that right? Is one.
Yeah, I think you got it all right as far as I'm concerned.
Okay,
yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? So I'm thinking about this in terms of, I mean, this emphasis isn't so much there in Deleuze. It's there in Luhmann a bit. I'm definitely thinking in terms of information theory myself.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, yeah. And so, you know, nonsense as noise. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking.
Okay. I've got some diagrams I think you might like to see, but I'll do that another. So here's the question. You hinted at a wider project. So I'm now very curious as to what this is a part of, to see if it maps onto anything I might be doing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the specific sort of framework that the exegesis in this paper is going to kind of flow into is an article in political philosophy, which might seem odd, Brett, but to do with constitutions, right, and constitutional theory. So in constitutional theory, there's this kind of paradoxical concept, which is constituent power, right? So the idea, I mean, the American Constitution, we the people, you know, the idea that a constitution has an author, or there is a certain power that invests the constitution somehow. But the constitution, by virtue of the fact that what it does is it specifies the kind of legitimate exercise of political power. So it limits ultimately the way in which power is able to be used. It sort of necessarily has a paradoxical relationship to that constituent power. So it can't, for instance, say very much about constituent power, how constituent power ought to be exercised, etc. Right? Because in so doing, it potentially oversteps the boundaries, or it, you know, this is like, if you like, a child trying to raise its parent, even though that does indeed happen, right? This is a kind of, you know, an upstream move, right, which is illegitimate from the perspective of a hierarchy of laws or norms, something like this, right? Now, this is like, a lot of people have spilled a lot of ink thinking about the paradox of constituent power. So it seems to be something that's both internal to and external necessarily to a given legal system or a given sort of constituted order. And what I'm hoping to do with this work on Deleuze and Luhmann and the concept of sense is to make the argument that, well, this is because from the perspective of sort of systems theory, or from the perspective of a theory of sense, constituent power is a kind of paradoxical element, right? It's kind of necessarily there in order to kind of distribute a given constitutional order or a given set of laws, but it's also necessarily excluded from that order in order precisely to be the sort of transcendent source of that order's power or something like this, or authority. And, you know, by reframing the problem in terms of sense, hopefully this can sort of clarify things for you know, political and legal theorists working on the problem of constituent power. So that's kind of the broader framework in which this exegesis is kind of, you know, going to hopefully do some work. But obviously I'm a little way from making that whole argument sort of coherent at this point. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I'll give you kind of my version, and you can tell me if it's even close.
Please. Yep.
So I've got this model where I've got organizational ethics, individual ethics. Individual behavior is the product of both of those, and collective behavior equals culture, from which you get cultural artifacts. Cultural artifacts influence the organizational ethics, and so on and so on, right? So this is where we get these standards of right and wrong in a constitution, maybe, or in a Bible, or in a Quran. There's also the feelings of right and wrong, which is the sense data coming in and triggering our sense of being offended or not. So you've got the individual. So I don't think a corporation feels guilt or shame, right? But it's certainly the individual is triggered by something, and therefore event data, which, by the way, if you go to event-driven architecture, actually shapes the individual itself, of course, over time. And that interaction between them means that your constitution itself is an artifact, or the Quran or the Bible, right, is an artifact within an organizational ethics which is continually being updated by, anyway, it's all about feedback loops. So I do actually have from a corporate governance perspective, I think I've got an equivalent thing. I could be miles off. Is that kind of what you mean?
That's
Wow.
precisely how I'm thinking about it as well. Of course, I mean, the other quirk, of course, is that, you know, so a constitution necessarily needs to, like a religious text, needs to present itself as kind of like an absolute origin, right? As something that's like, but you're absolutely right. Actually, that's a retroactive effect, like of the system, the daily operations of the system itself.
Yeah.
We need this to sort of have a kind of fictional, you know, immaculate kind of conception sort of story in order for it precisely to serve as the kind of basis for the ongoing operations of the system. Because once we acknowledge the contingency of the thing, suddenly its authority is no longer effective in the same way, right?
Oh, right. Yes. So you need a foundation myth in order to establish the Constitution or the virgin birth to be able to say this is what we can trust. Yes, I get it.
All of which is there in psychoanalysis, right? In, you know, Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? The idea of, you know, of naming and so on, right? I mean, or indeed the fact that, you know, once we're in a symbolic order, that order is kind of experienced or presents itself as kind of absolute or total, right? So, you know, even if I see something that I don't know the name of, I have the language precisely to say, you know, that's, I don't know what that is, or that's nonsense, or what have you, right? So the universe created in sense is total, but obviously an infant acquires language gradually. But it's precisely this gradual acquisition which sort of needs to be repressed, right? Because if we, this is what I was sort of saying previously about reading the paper, right? If we start to sort of be attentive to the fact that actually all we're doing is making sounds to one another, very quickly the sort of the necessary operating fictions, if you like, start to sort of fray. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it sounds as if you're very much on the same page in terms of some of the problems that you're thinking about.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Would you be okay? I've got a couple of diagrams that immediately spring to mind. If I put them in chat, just have a look at
please
them.
do.
Feel like
That'd be great.
Be useful. We can compare notes another time. Thank you very much. I think maybe I said in a few months I might understand it. I think I'm a bit even closer now, so I appreciate it.
Sounds like you're pretty close. Yeah. Thanks.
George, go ahead.
Yes, hello. Focusing on this issue, I mean, the one thing, quite frankly, that really spoke to me, that had some grounding, is this notion of sense and nonsense, which is, I mean, certainly, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, I read a sense of power here. In other words, power determines what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So in the past, homosexuality did not make sense, for instance, right? Just to give that example. Or you know, more contemporarily, you know, the billionaire class makes sense. To think outside the billionaire class is senseless. So, I mean, I guess my question is twofold. One is, well, first, I mean, do I have a correct understanding? But assuming that I do, is this the subject? Is this the subject of power? Or is there an authentic self? Is there a truth in all of this, right? Is there a metaphysical truth that we can seize on, right? So granted, the power structure is going to seek to define for us what makes sense and what is senseless. But again, can the philosopher say, from a purely objective, and I use the word authentic again, authentic point of view, is there rationality? Is there sense? And is there senseless? So philosophically, we can say homosexuality makes perfect sense. From a metaphysical, political point of view, I mean, philosophical point of view, the billionaire class makes no sense, right? Or is it just all subjective? The other alternative would be it's just all subjective points of view, and there's no valid truth. So, you know, those are my observations. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's all subjective, relative, and, you know, there's no truth, or there's no kind of transcendent, or, you know, no standard that we can use to, you know, compare adjudicating truth claims or something like this. I mean, it might be a overly glib or an unsatisfactory answer, but I mean, I suppose that the truth is nonsense. I mean, as far as, for instance, Deleuze is concerned, right? So, you know, the fact that a given order of sense or distribution of sense is always kind of forced to sort of to revise itself or to respond to or to acknowledge in various ways, so paradox being the preeminent form, its own contingency and limitations. This itself tells us a kind of metaphysical truth, right? This gives us a metaphysical kind of truth about reality, which is precisely that a given distribution of sense is synthetic or artificial. This is true, right? It's not simply like a perspective that is one opinion among others. What Deleuze is trying to kind of excavate here is the fact that any given common sense or idea, socially sanctioned idea of what makes sense and what doesn't, is forced always to confront precisely its own limits in the form of what doesn't make sense. And this is what we ought to be attentive to if we're going to try and get a grip on what the nature of reality is. I mean, Deleuze in some respects is a really, really traditional, conceives of his project as a very, very traditional metaphysical philosophical project, right? I'm trying to get a grip on like the nature of reality. The problem is that we have all these doxic projections, we have all these ideas about reality, which are constructed in the service of our own projects or our own interests. The task of philosophy is precisely to shatter these and to get us closer to some picture of how things really are. And I think power, you mentioned power, is playing a really central role here, right? So it's always centers of power or force which determine a given distribution of common sense, or what Foucault would have called an episteme or something like this. But the fact that this process is never absolutely successful, so it's never the case that a given distribution of sense succeeds in just kind of explaining everything for us, or in being absolutely stable. There's always this kind of process of, homosexuality is a really good example of, the way in which something forces our societies to change, the way in which they understand terms and the way in which they think and so on and so forth. It's precisely this constitutive difference, this kind of nonsense, this kind of insistence of the paradoxical, which gives us a kind of clue as to the nature of reality itself. Which for Deleuze, Deleuze's metaphysics, which obviously I haven't really spent any time unpacking today, but it's a metaphysics which privileges the differential over identity. So you've got an account of reality ultimately is characterized by pure differential processes which sort of indifferentiating themselves kind of actualize or produce the appearance of stable, self-identical individuals, but ultimately this is only ever an appearance. All we really have is sort of difference all the way down, so to speak. And this is a metaphysical reality, right, which we can be more or less well attuned to. I hope that
listening to you, I feel forced to put you in the camp of the anti-enlightenment and Nietzschean thought, which is that social reality or society is simply a cycle of stability and instability. So there's simply an endless struggle between what is sense and what is nonsense. And that, again, there's never really a truth position that is universal and stable.
But so I'd associate myself with the Enlightenment. That's an unfashionable thing to do these days, but certainly, that's necessitated, for instance, by my teaching, I believe in reason and justice and so on, right? As trans social norms of some kind, right? Without necessarily going full Platonist, right? But it's important that we have a vocabulary with which we're able to say that slave-owning society is worse than this society where there are no slaves, right? I'm certainly committed to these kinds of, this is a necessity for philosophy. But I suppose that account that you just provided there, which was a really good account, I think, of a kind of, a certain type of Nietzschean, Foucauldian, maybe postmodern sort of idea, right, of this kind of cycle of, societies that are stabilizing and destabilizing and so on. I suppose my sense is, and I appreciate that, I reading between the lines, I suspect that that's not your own sort of view of things.
Yeah, you're correct.
And it's nor is it mine, right? And I think the way that you articulated it really beautifully drew out the fact that way of presenting things undercuts itself, right? I mean, so surely that's an ontological description of like the nature of reality that I, as a reasonable subject, should be prepared to accept as like, you know, more or less true. This is like always what gets me about, you know, sort of absolute relativist positions is like, well, all moral norms are relative to given societies. That claim purports to be a universal claim, right, about the nature of morality. So there seems to be a logical inconsistency to me with those kinds of relativisms, which just make no sense whatsoever. Seems to me as much as we are, you know, sense-using creatures, which is to say we are members of sort of political communities and we give one another reasons for what we believe, we are committed necessarily to the universality of those reasons. Yeah. So
right. But I mean, I guess, but my point is simply to say that in the way you describe it and the way you're describing it, right, and without ascribing any values onto you, I'm reading what you're saying as, again, and I subscribe to universalist beliefs and the idea that you can have a stable society based on universal beliefs that there is a broad and enduring consensus on. And so for me, the idea of sense and nonsense is determined by those universal values that underwrite human society. So, but my point is that listening to you in terms of the ideas you're presented, in my mind, are much more rooted, if not entirely rooted, in the Nietzschean idea of just, hey, and granted, I share the idea, it's a very cynical view, the world is just a cycle of stability and instability. And that's all it is. And so, you know, one day it'll be homosexuality is good, tomorrow it'll be bad, the next day it'll be good again, right? Again, very narcissistic, very not narcissistic for me, but very nihilistic. But that's my reading of what you're arguing, for better, for worse. And I don't mean to ascribe anything to you personally, just what I'm listening to.
Sure, yeah. Again, I mean, I think I quoted Luhmann a couple of times, right? So like reality is resistance to communication, right? So I mean, you know, like there is a reality out there. It's not like a kind of carte blanche nihilism or something like this, or a kind of idealism, or, you know, whatever it might be. There's a real reality out there, and we can be more or less well attuned to the nature of that reality. I'm very committed to that kind of, if you like, post-scientific, post-enlightenment sort of epistemology. Not a relativist of any kind. I don't think either of these thinkers that I've been trying to
really interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Philip, your turn.
Okay. So your previous comment with George helped me a little bit to maybe understand your position on truth. I guess you're more of a you do believe in the correspondence theory of truth, right? That there is an underlying reality out there, and that our proposition is made true by facts about the world, right? And you believe in facts. I hope that makes sense. And also, you also talk a little bit about what you mean by sense, as in functional reduction of complexity. Then therefore, ergo, I imagine that, you know, so a system that could be complex, but a functional reduction of that would be a description that describe the system. So now a system could be, you know, you can have a sense that is true and a sense that is false, right? You know, like, for example, Trump likes to frame everything as, you know, the United States is doing badly because other countries made it so. It's not, that's false, right? It's something that is endogenous within the US system itself that makes it so. So there are truth of the matter and fault and the falsity of that matter. So I think you do believe in the correspondence theory of truth. Is that right?
I wouldn't quite put it that way. So you said something about I believe in facts. I suppose I'm tempted to, it's a bit pithy, but tempted to take a kind of Rortian perspective here. I'm not that interested in facts, really. You know, I believe, yeah, sure, I believe in them, but I'm not that interested in them, I suppose would be the sort of like, you know, slightly Rortian response to something like that. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a correspondence theorist, but I do believe in truth of some description. I'm more persuaded on these questions. So like Deleuze follows a little bit someone like Nietzsche here, and this is like, these are the questions that analytic philosophy becomes very preoccupied with in the 20th century, right? What does it mean for a proposition to be truthful as opposed to false, you know? And, you know, Deleuze sees these as sort of, in some respects, you know, less interesting questions than the question of, well, what does it mean for a proposition to make sense, rather than for a proposition to not make sense. So I suppose I'm more interested in discussion at that level than the question of truth itself. I'm broadly committed to something like, I mean, I quite like pragmatist theories of truth, which nevertheless acknowledge that like truth is not like a capricious, I can't just decide what's true. So it involves a community, but, you know, a community of inquiry. I mean, here I think of Peirce, right? The idea that, you know, so if we all decide that the earth is flat, that's not sufficient, right? But if we as a community of inquirers investigate the world outside of our community and gradually come to discover things about that world, we can be more or less sure that the things that we discover are true. So and importantly, right, the idea that, you know, an adequate or an absolute knowledge of reality is a kind of necessarily constantly receding object, right? We never get to a place of like absolute knowledge of reality. So, you know, broadly, I hope what I'm describing is like a scientific epistemology. So science doesn't say it's true that there was a Big Bang, right? I mean, it deals in theories. And in falsifiable theories. That seems to me to be a pretty good, modest approach to epistemology. In some respects, it's not that interested in this question of truth, right? I mean, it's much more interested in, okay, like, you know, if I make a statement like, well, all Capricorns are like X or what have you, right? I mean, and there's no way to falsify that statement, then, you know, there's a problem with the statement from the perspective of its ability to describe reality. I mean, that seems pretty good to me. Does this make sense?
It seems like for the pragmatist theory of truth is that they find truth to be what is useful, and what's useful is what is defined by the community. And if that's the case, then if the community agrees with it, that certain propositions, and if it's useful for that community, like, you know, that's it. I mean, but then you then say that there is some sort of convergence towards something. But if there's convergence towards something, then you're now taking truth to be something realist. You're taking truth to be more than just, you know, a community consensus of what is useful, but of something that is mind independent. So the postulation of facts is that it is the truth maker that grounds propositions, what analytic philosophers, the truth makers, and facts are mind independent. So it seems to me that you do believe in facts. You do believe that there is a mind independent world out there that grounds the truth of propositions, and that's what the community of science ultimately converge toward.
Yeah,
that is my.
But I mean, scientists don't think in terms of, I mean, they don't kind of blanket sweeping statement that is probably best not being made necessarily. But, you know, I mean, science as a rule does not tend to be preoccupied with like, you know, what is the nature of a fact, right? I mean, they're preoccupied with particular operations in certain circumscribed sort of discursive experimental areas. So if we do this, then what is likely to occur? Or, you know, how is it possible to disprove this thesis? You know, is this thesis a more reliable one on balance than this other one? These are the types of questions that like actual inquiry sort of tends to involve, rather than these sort of, you know, I suppose these very these are questions which philosophy, I think, gets very hung up on. So what does it mean for a statement to be absolutely factual or something like this? I mean, my sense is that these are not particularly useful. Certainly, I believe in like a mind-independent reality, yes. But I'm not that interested in sort of, what makes a proposition factual or not. These types of questions, I just don't think they're that useful to answer.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem.
Conrad, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Just wondering, what is the central problem that you're trying to solve? Like, if you were to explain it to someone on the street, so say you're walking down the street, or you're to meet someone new, and they haven't listened to this lecture, or they haven't read Deleuze, like, what is the central thing that you're having? Because you said you're still working on this at an experimental stage. You said the last part of your paper was still being processed. So I'm quite curious. What's I've got another question afterwards. So what would you say, as I said, if you could explain it in extremely simple language, what would you say is the thing? Because I'm very interested in how people resolve their inner contradictions and the things they find confusing in the world, because you just gave a great presentation talking about sense and nonsense, and a lot of the comments were brilliant in this group. So I'm just wondering, in your own discovery, you're experiencing nonsense yourself in terms of trying to bring order to complexity. Could you talk about that to a lay person, and in particular what you're actually trying to resolve?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. Like, we are increasingly in sort of academic contexts prompted to have these sort of elevator pitch, so communicate your research like to a lay person. And I must say, I feel ambiguous about it, right? Because on the one hand, I think it's really good for ideas to be democratic and to be communicable to non-specialists. But on the other hand, like, I'm also resistant to the idea that, well, we can distill everything down to a simple elevator pitch or something like this. So, I'm ambivalent always when, I need to try and sort of distill or simplify in that way. Look, but to the person in the street, I'd probably say, well, what does it mean to say that my sentences have meaning? That's the problem. I mean, I don't have an answer to it yet, right? But that's the problem, I suppose, that I'm interested in, right? What does it mean for a sentence to be meaningful as opposed to a sentence that's not meaningful? What quality needs to be there? And I hope you can see, just to that conversation with Philip just before, it's a different species of question to, like, what does it mean for a sentence to be factual or true? What does it mean for a sentence precisely to have meaning? That's the problem I'm sort of interested in. I'd be really interested, incidentally, to hear what that person in the street had to say about, what their thoughts, right? Because I don't have a clear answer to that question as yet. That's precisely sort of the project.
Yeah, because it's a fascinating thing. I mean, ultimately, like, I do believe we're, with meaning-seeking creatures, and that's why we form into groups and tribes, because that's where we find meaning, because we're not this lost sheep. We belong to something. So my next question is, could you explain to me now, Deleuze talks about difference in identity, and I haven't researched this, but I just read briefly about it, and that he came up with this genius idea that, it's not about what our identity is and what makes us unique, but how the difference is the most important thing. Well, maybe that's the wrong word, using the word important, but I just wanted if you could comment on that, in the sense, if you could talk about that in relation to the following. So talk about Deleuze's theory of difference in identity in relation to this, which is something I've observed. One of my observations of life over many years is that people are forming their bonds and their tribes and their ideologies, and they're connecting to them, not so much for what the things represent, but so they can distinguish themselves and for everything not to be the same. In other words, difference, because maybe I was sort of thinking along the same terms as Deleuze, in that a lot of people's self-identity is actually difference. And I'm just wondering if that's what you think and that's what Deleuze was saying, or am I not seeing it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly identity, I mean, it's like worth looking at the etymological. I mean, what we're talking about here is the identical, right? So when we're looking for identity, we're looking for the same, ultimately. So, you know, self-identity, like, am I the same throughout time? Something like this. Fairly obviously, at some sort of metaphysical, descriptive level, I mean, we're not, right? We change over time. And yet what's presupposed is some kind of identity. Deleuze, is, you're absolutely right, is precisely interested in emphasizing the importance of the fact that philosophy historically has repressed difference in favor of an emphasis on identity. So the sort of looking for the same, like how things, you know, relate to one another in terms of what is the same, what is general about between two terms, for instance, rather than looking at difference. And as soon as we sort of concentrate on difference as a kind of constitutive aspect of, you know, the types of beings we are and the type of reality we live in, we grasp that, you know, difference has a kind of ontological status, right? So difference is like productive, differentially productive. So like the image I always kind of think of is like thermodynamics, and the fact that a steam engine, for instance, or any kind of engine, is going to work in some variety of this way, right? A steam engine, what do you have? Like, you've got cold, you've got water, and you've got fire, right? You heat the water to such an extent that the steam, the difference between these two sort of substances, or these two temperatures, needs to resolve itself somehow, and you get steam, right? Which powers a machine. This is the way of thinking about the fact that difference is kind of differentially productive. Right. So, you know, all of reality ultimately can be understood in terms of differences of forces which are kind of relating to one another, interacting in various ways, becoming active, passive, and as such producing such sort of perspectival effects as temporally continuous actualized individuals. Philosophy has tended historically to focus overwhelmingly on the latter, rather than the kind of genetic differential processes which actually produce such things as individuals. Yeah, so I think you broadly have things right there in terms of your reading of Deleuze.
Yeah, because like one of the things that's been brought up a lot in this group and many times is this world we're living in, and there's a lot of complexity, a lot of different groups, a lot of polarization, and it's all very interesting to observe that from a philosophical perspective in terms of what you just talked about. What is all this conflict that's going on in the world? All of it is difference. You take away the difference, and two tribes cannot kill each other because they believe the same things and they're suddenly members of the same family. If you're the same, and so if all the individuals in the world had what they wanted, which was people to be similar to them, you'd eventually have no difference, and then there'd be nothing to say because everyone would think and do the same thing. So we live in this yin and yang world of difference and similarity, and this perpetual battle between, basically, if you think about conservatism and progressivism, you know, one trying to conserve and be the same and hold on to tradition, and the other one trying to explore, to bring the species forward and see where it's heading towards. And so this is like this. I just found, yeah. So your talk anyway. I just wanted to thank you a lot. It definitely brought up some things that I've been thinking about.
Oh, great. Yeah, no problems. I'm glad it's been thought-provoking. I've just seen the time, so I'll have to go on the hour at 5. I'll have to take off, and I do see there's like a couple more questions. I can try and answer a couple more questions very quickly though.
Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Hi, Timothy. Thanks. Is that too loud, David?
That's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, thanks for your talk. Shamefully, I slept through some of it, but I did like the fact that Luhmann appears to have a mentor in Talcott Parsons, which I thought was quite interesting. Our friend Richard Volpato likes to talk about Talcott Parsons, I believe. So some of those people, they talk about some interesting things. Conrad was just talking about conservatism versus progressivism. And I think it's important to note that both sides of politics in most countries are actually two types of progressivism, it seems, and not conservatism versus progressivism. So it's almost like the political system is skewed towards progressivism. They're just different types of progressivism. So libertarianism could be considered as as everything should be the markets, which is in a sense a form of progressivism. But traditionalism is like a third way of government, perhaps. So that's sort of been under. It's one of the oldest. It's probably the oldest forms of government. But obviously, philosophy is different. Is not necessarily the same as politics, although there is political philosophy. But a lot of the time, when we have in science, when there's a seeming paradox, it's just we don't understand enough about the phenomenon. And so, for example, when people criticize Einstein, for example, this is a classic example, when they point to special relativity and general relativity and say it's wrong for Newtonian reasons. Well, obviously, if you're approaching things from a Newtonian perspective, you're sort of throwing out some of the logic that is required to come to the Einsteinian conclusion. So in a sense, you sort of need to step into another dimension in order to understand things conceptually. In Big Bang Theory, the TV series, they talk about symmetric asymmetry. So in 10 dimensions it may be asymmetric, but in 11 dimensions it's symmetric, sort of thing. So sometimes by looking at things from a higher dimensional perspective, you can come to a conclusion. Another example is there are some famous paradoxes like Zeno's paradox, the lamp paradox, others. Wikipedia has a whole page on different paradoxes. So usually they can be resolved by stepping outside of the paradox. So in the case of the lamp paradox, it turns out that whether the light is on or off is undefined. I also found it interesting that me and Rowan, our famous Rowan, that passed away in late 2023. We used to have long debates on Shannon's information theory and complexity theory, chaos theory, and that sort of thing. So the equations turned out that they're actually really similar. I think that Shannon's information theory is a little bit more general than complexity theory, which I thought was interesting. And they talk about complexity theory in the beginning of the universe and how it was a low information state and that sort of thing. So I think perhaps, if I'd have to go back to my notes, but I think perhaps Shannon information theory might be a more generalized form of other similar theories. But
shall we give Jonathan a go now, Timothy, if you've got time?
Yeah, yep, sure.
Right.
So, based on what I've heard of Deleuze, he has this rhizomatic thinking. Mainly that he doesn't think of a hierarchical system. He thinks of it like a web, basically, where you have all these multitude of conflicting things or a set of things. And once you have that, you have this non-linear, decentralized approach to thinking about things. Given that framework, and given the fact that it seems that Luhmann is this kind of self-referential, autopiotic systems theory of how social systems operate and whatnot when they communicate and so on. Your attempt to synthesize the two in a way that makes sense, while fruitful, makes me question something. Since most societies are hierarchical, they for centuries upon centuries, and while some starting societies and a few outliers are not hierarchical, what do you think when it comes to this Deleuze idea of contradictions giving birth to consistencies, or being the boundary of it, being this additional thing that gives birth to consistency? Because I think that's what you're trying to say when you say the nonsense is somehow in an important facet, although otherwise there's no real reason to even talk about it. What do you I guess the best way I could say it is, how does society form these ideas over time in relation to Deleuze's ideology of how ideas are formed, given Luhmann's framework?
I mean, in terms of how sort of, I suppose, what I take you to be sort of getting at is how this relative stability in terms of the way in which we use sense, or our ideas, is formed. I mean, this is through habit, I would say, through habituation. So Deleuze certainly doesn't want to deny the fact that we are creatures of habit, and that it's useful for us to, for instance, have words which mean the same thing every time we encounter the same object or whatever it might be. But we need to be mindful of the fact that this is a kind of purely contingent state of affairs, which could always be sort of constructed otherwise. And I suppose just to tie back to some of the sort of ethical dimensions of, I think it was maybe Conrad, or I can't remember who was specifically sort of speaking about difference as a source of sort of conflict or whatever it might be. I mean, I read it very much in a different direction, right? So if we sort of reconcile ourselves, and philosophy is the vehicle for this, I suspect, for someone like Deleuze, to the fact that difference is just part of the sort of structure of reality, something like this, so that the way that we happen to think, or the terms that we happen to use, are inevitably in some respects going to be sort of incomplete or inadequate. They're going to need to be revised, perhaps, in the face of the different types of encounters that we have with others. I suppose the idea here, and this goes back again to the discussion that we had earlier about the Enlightenment as well, right? The idea is that this ought to prompt us to be sort of tolerant of difference, right? I mean, and precisely not murderously, violent, defending our own particular identity or something like this, because we should come to acknowledge actually that our own identity is a kind of highly artificial after effect, if you like, of differential processes. So I see in all of this, a profoundly, if you like, well, socialist, if you want to use that kind of term, or certainly sort of anti-hierarchical ethos, and indeed politics, right? A kind of, it's possible, eminently possible, and indeed perhaps desirable, to think a kind of, Deleuzean informed communism or something like this. I mean, I think these are meaningful projects, ethical projects, which flow from the sort of metaphysical account of sense that has interested me in particular today. I don't know if that makes sense. I do have to take off in a second.
Okay, I'll try to be really quick then.
Sure.
Okay, so if I were to think of it this way, what you're saying You're basically saying the map of our reality, whether the social realm or the ontological realm, can be infinitely differentiated, or can be made completely simple. And I'll just give a simple example. Let's say a tribe encounters an animal, let's say a tiger, but they usually encounter this tiger filled with insects. So conceptually, they form a word to mean the insects and the tiger simultaneously. So in their eyes, the insects and the tiger are one entity, even though in our eyes, they're distinct.
Yep.
We're both pointing to the same thing, but the words and how we frame those things are distinct.
That's a really good example. Yeah, absolutely. Of the contingency of these identities. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. All right, look, I'm sorry. I would love to stay and chat, but I have to get going to another commitment. But yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you,
for all
Tim.
the questions.
Thanks for the presentation and being in the hot seat for 3 hours now.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyway, the video recording will probably be available in a couple of days.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. And thanks, David, for organizing and the invite. And see you later.
Right. Cheerio.
Bye.